My foster sister walked into my divorce mediation wearing my stolen wedding ring over her pristine white gloves. She bypassed the empty chairs, slid right next to my husband Julian, and rested a hand on her swollen, pregnant belly. With a practiced, sickeningly sweet smile, she leaned across the mahogany table and dropped a crisp $50 bill right in front of me. "Buy a bus ticket, Valerie," she whispered, smoothing her maternity dress. "Do not worry about a thing. I will take much better care of your husband than you ever did." No one stopped her. The mediator simply looked away. My lawyer just opened a heavy leather folder. And within exactly 4 minutes, my husband's smug face turned completely pale. If you have ever had your blood family sacrifice your sanity to protect their public image, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe because you need to hear how I dismantled a 30-year lie and took back my life. The air in the downtown Chicago mediation room was thick with the kind of expensive cologne Julian always wore to intimidate people. At 36, he was a wealth management executive who prided himself on his tailored suits and his aggressive negotiation tactics. I sat across from him, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I am 33 years old, an elite cybersecurity auditor, and I have spent my entire life being called the cold, emotionless machine of my family. Today, I was going to show them exactly how efficient a machine can be. Julian slid a legal document across the polished wood. "Sign the deed over to me, Valerie," he demanded, tapping his expensive pen against the table. "I need your ancestral home to cover the business losses you caused during our separation. You owe me this house. It is the least you can do after stressing Desiree and the baby." Desiree, my foster sister. 31 years old, the beloved church choir director, the absolute angel of our community. Growing up, she was the fragile rescue child my parents adored, while I was the difficult biological daughter who asked too many questions. Now she was carrying the child I supposedly could not give him. She sat there rubbing her belly, playing the perfect victim, waiting for me to break down and cry. But I did not cry. I did not even blink. I simply turned my head slightly and gave a small nod to my attorney. Ms. Harper, a powerhouse of a woman who commanded respect the second she entered any room, did not say a single word. She just lifted a massive 2-inch thick ledger and dropped it onto the glass table with a deafening slam. The thud echoed off the walls, making Desiree jump in her seat. I leaned forward, clasping hands together. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and utterly flat. "Did you honestly think a cybersecurity auditor would not notice you wiring $2 million of your client's money into offshore accounts under Desiree's name?" The silence that followed was absolute. Julian stopped tapping his pen. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden chalky pallor. He looked at the ledger, then at Ms. Harper, and finally back at me. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was a white man used to talking his way out of every corner, leveraging his charm to get whatever he wanted. He thought I was just a bitter ex-wife who would hand him my family home to avoid a public scandal. He never expected me to trace his digital footprints. Desiree shifted uncomfortably, her hand freezing on her fake designer handbag. "What is she talking about, Julian?" she asked, her high-pitched voice trembling with genuine panic. "Tell her to shut up. Tell her she is lying." I did not give him a chance to answer. I opened the ledger and slid the first page toward them. "This is the blockchain transaction record." I continued, my voice steady and loud enough to cut through their panic. "Last Tuesday at midnight, you bypassed your firm's security protocol. You funneled stolen money through 3 shell companies before landing it in a Cayman Islands account. An account that Desiree opened during her church mission trip last year. You are both looking at federal wire fraud charges. The $50 you threw at me will not cover your first phone call from prison." Julian gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. He tried to muster his usual commanding tone. "You hacked my firm. That is illegal, Valerie. I will have you arrested for corporate espionage before you can even file those papers." Ms. Harper finally spoke, her tone dripping with professional disdain. "Actually, Julian, my client was subpoenaed by the federal government to conduct a security audit on your firm 3 weeks ago. She is acting under federal jurisdiction. You are not fighting a bitter wife today. You are fighting the United States government. Julian looked like he was going to vomit. The perfectly constructed illusion of his wealth, his power, and his untouchable status was crumbling right in front of his new pregnant mistress. Desiree started breathing heavily, clutching her chest, falling right back into her favorite role of the fragile, overwhelmed victim. She began wailing, crying out that the stress was harming the baby, that I was a monster trying to destroy her miracle child out of pure jealousy. Before the mediator could even call for a recess, the heavy oak doors of the conference room burst wide open. I did not even have to look to know who it was. The sharp scent of peppermint and righteous indignation filled the room. It was Pastor Calvin and First Lady Beatrice, my parents. They rushed into the room. Their anger was not directed at the man who cheated on their daughter. It was not directed at the foster sister who destroyed my marriage. My father marched past Julian and pointed a furious finger directly at my face. "Withdraw this lawsuit immediately, Valerie," my father bellowed, his voice, carrying the booming authority he usually reserved for Sunday sermons. "You are going to drop these ridiculous financial charges right now. Julian has officially pledged $500,000 to our new sanctuary building fund. Withdraw this lawsuit immediately." Valerie, my father bellowed, his voice carrying the booming authority he usually reserved for Sunday sermons. "You are going to drop these ridiculous financial charges right now. Julian has officially pledged $500,000 to our new sanctuary building fund." I stared at the man who had raised me. The gold cross on his tailored lapel caught the harsh fluorescent light of the mediation room. I pointed to the heavy ledger currently sitting in front of my soon-to-be ex-husband. "Dad, that pledge is worthless," I said, my voice dangerously steady. "Julian does not have $500,000. He embezzled $2 million from his wealth management clients and funneled it through Desiree. They are going to federal prison." My mother. Beatrice pushed past my father. She wore her pristine Sunday church suit, a matching lavender hat resting perfectly on her meticulously styled hair. She did not look at the ledger. She did not look at the terrified sweat pooling on Julian's forehead. She marched straight to the mahogany table and swept her arm across it violently, slapping my evidence ledger onto the floor. "You are a bitter, barren woman, Valerie," my mother hissed, her eyes flashing with a vitriol that took my breath away. "You could not keep this good man happy. You could not give him a family. Now your foster sister is carrying his miracle white child, a child that will finally bring true prestige to our congregation, and you are trying to destroy them out of pure spite." The words echoed in the small room. A miracle, white child. That was what my mother called the product of my husband's infidelity. Growing up, I was always too dark, too outspoken, too independent for the respectable image my parents wanted to project to their megachurch congregation. Desiree was the light-skinned, compliant foster daughter who directed the choir and played the perfect saint. Now she had secured the ultimate prize in my parents' eyes, a wealthy white executive who promised to fund their new church wing. "He is a thief, Mom," I said, refusing to break eye contact. "He is using the church to launder money." Pastor Calvin slammed his hand on the back of Desiree's chair. "Julian is the treasurer of our church board," he fired back. "He is a financial genius who has doubled our congregation's investment portfolio. You are just an auditor seeing ghosts because you are jealous. Your sister got the life you failed to build. Apologize to them right now, or you are no longer welcome in our family." I looked at the four of them. My father, the pastor, defending a criminal. My mother, the first lady, coddling the mistress. Desiree, the holy choir director, rubbing a belly filled with deceit. And Julian. Julian realized the cavalry had arrived. The panic that had gripped him just moments ago vanished completely. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and leaned back in his leather chair, letting a slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He knew my parents valued the illusion of his wealth and the status he brought to their church more than they valued my life. They completely ignored the fact that I was the one secretly funding the church's community outreach programs for the past 5 years. while Julian was draining their accounts. Actually, Calvin Julian said, his voice regaining its smooth corporate edge. Valerie is not just projecting her jealousy. She is projecting her own financial failures onto me. He snapped his fingers, and Desiree eagerly dug into her oversized designer bag, the one I had paid for last Christmas. She pulled out a stack of legal documents and slid them across the table. Julian tapped the top page. "I did not want to do this in front of your parents, Valerie," Julian said, feigning a tone of deep regret. "But since you want to throw baseless accusations around, I think we should talk about your cybersecurity firm." My lawyer. Ms. Harper stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she picked up the documents. "What is this garbage?" she demanded. "It is a notice of lien." Julian smiled, showing his perfectly whitened teeth. "As your legal spouse, I exercised my right to leverage our shared marital assets. I took out a business loan using your cybersecurity firm as collateral. The church board graciously approved the debt acquisition through our private holding company. Since you have frozen our joint accounts and caused me undue financial distress, the creditors have officially placed a lien on your entire business. You own nothing, Valerie." Ms. Harper flipped through the pages rapidly. "This spousal consent signature is a blatant forgery," she stated, her voice slicing through his smugness. "You cannot authorize a lien on a company she established prior to the marriage without her physical presence and a notary. Furthermore, the idea that a church board would approve a hostile debt takeover is legally absurd." Julian chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Good luck proving that in court with the church board backing my timeline. I am a respected wealth management director. She is an angry ex-wife, losing her grip on reality. Who do you think the judge will believe?" I stared at him, letting the reality of his manipulation wash over me. He had used my parents' blind worship of his status to weaponize their church board against my life's work. He thought stripping my business would leave me entirely defenseless. He thought I was the same woman who quietly paid off his secret gambling debts 3 years ago just to keep the peace. "You forged my signature to steal my firm," I asked, my tone completely devoid of emotion. "I secured our family's future," Julian corrected smoothly, wrapping an arm around Desiree's chair. "A future you clearly cannot provide. Now drop the divorce settlement demands, hand over the deed to the ancestral house, and walk away quietly. If you do, I might convince the board to let you keep a small percentage of your company." Before I could unleash the forensic response I had prepared, Desiree suddenly lurched forward. She gripped the edge of the glass table, her face contorting into an exaggerated mask of agony. "My baby," she wailed, her voice piercing and shrill. "Julian, it hurts. The stress she is putting so much stress on the baby." Beatrice flew into an absolute panic. She dropped her designer purse and rushed to Desiree's side, hovering over her like a protective shield. "Calm down, sweetie, breathe for the baby," my mother cooed, shooting me a look of pure venom. "Look what you are doing, Valerie. You are literally killing your own niece or nephew." "Get out. I am the one being defrauded here," I said, holding my ground. "I said get out!" my father roared, stepping toward me with his fists clenched. "You have brought nothing but shame to this family today. Do not you dare show your face at our church again until you have begged the Lord and your sister for forgiveness." Ms. Harper placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "We are leaving," she said quietly. "We have what we need." I did not argue. Arguing with blind people only exhausts your own vision. I turned around and began walking toward the heavy oak doors. Julian called out after me, his voice dripping with condescending victory. "Do not forget your $50, Valerie. Bus fares went up this year." I pushed the doors open and stepped into the carpeted hallway of the mediation center. As the heavy doors clicked shut behind me, severing the final tie, I had to my toxic family. My smartphone vibrated violently inside my blazer pocket. It was an urgent security notification from the automated hub I had personally wired into my ancestral house. I pulled the phone out to read the alert. My blood ran cold. "Warning, front door. Biometric lock disabled. Manual override engaged. Master access code deleted. New access credentials granted to Julian and Desiree." Julian and Desiree were not just threatening to take my home. They had already hired someone to change the locks and seize the property while we were sitting in this very building. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal, navigating the streets of South Shore toward the house my grandparents had built from the ground up. It was a beautiful graystone that had been in my family for 3 generations. A house I had poured my own money into restoring. I did not break the speed limit. I did not cry. I let the cold logic of my profession take over my mind, analyzing the variables of the situation. My parents had just handed my legacy over to the man who betrayed me and the foster sister who orchestrated it. By the time I pulled my car up to the wrought iron gates of my property, the violation was already in full swing. Julian was standing on my front porch, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his tailored trousers. A locksmith was kneeling by the heavy oak door, drilling into the brass deadbolt. And there on the manicured front lawn was Desiree. She was no longer clutching her stomach in fake agony. Instead, she was humming a gospel hymn while gleefully tossing my custom designer suits and silk blouses out of a heavy trash bag, letting them scatter across the damp grass. She was wearing my grandmother's vintage silk scarf around her neck, a piece she had clearly just dug out of my closet. "Oh, look, Julian," she sang out, her voice carrying over the quiet suburban street. "The former homeowner has arrived." I stepped out of my car, ignoring the clothes scattered at my feet. I walked straight up the stone pathway, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. Julian stepped in front of Desiree, playing the protective white knight, shielding his fragile pregnant damsel from the big angry black woman. It was a performance they had perfected. "You are trespassing, Valerie," Julian said, pulling a folded sheet of heavy paper from his jacket pocket. He held it up, letting the notary seal catch the afternoon light. "I told you the church board was handling your debt because you refused to cooperate in mediation. The congregation's investment arm purchased the outstanding mortgage on this property. As the newly appointed treasurer of that board, I am acting on their behalf. This house now belongs to the church, and as of 20 minutes ago, you are officially evicted." I looked at the document. It bore my father's signature right next to Julian's. Pastor Calvin had signed away his own biological daughter's ancestral home to pad his church's real estate portfolio and impress his wealthy white son-in-law. They were going to use my grandparents' house as a parsonage for the choir director and the treasurer. "You really outdid yourself, Julian," I said, my voice deadpan. "You convinced my father that stealing my home was an act of divine justice." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Desiree chimed in, resting a protective hand on her stomach. "He removes the bitter and the barren to make room for the blessed. This house needs a real family. Valerie, not a cold machine like you. Do not worry. I will make sure the nursery is painted a beautiful shade of sage green." I looked at the pile of expensive clothes on the lawn. Julian smirked, clearly expecting me to fall to my knees and weep over my ruined wardrobe. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to lash out so he could call the police and have me arrested for assaulting a pregnant woman on church property, thereby cementing my status as the villain in their twisted narrative. I did not give them the satisfaction. "Keep the clothes, Desiree," I said smoothly. "They always did look better on a hanger than they ever will on you. But since you are so eager to take over my life, you will not mind if I grab my grandfather's old toolbox from the utility room before I go. It belongs to my family, not the church board." Julian hesitated, but his arrogance won out. He gestured toward the side door of the garage with a mock bow. "Make it quick, Valerie, and do not try taking any of the smart home hubs. Those are fixtures of the property now." I walked past them without another word, my heels clicking against the concrete floor of the garage. I bypassed the tool benches and went straight to the hidden utility panel behind the water heater. Julian thought he was so smart acquiring the physical deed to the house, but he completely forgot who actually wired the place. When I renovated the Greystone, I installed a military-grade smart home security and climate control grid. I wrote the code. I built the infrastructure. I owned the digital soul of the house. I opened the panel, revealing a complex web of fiber optic cables and circuit boards. I did not smash anything, I did not cause physical damage that he could sue me for. Instead, I calmly reached in and severed a single innocuous-looking blue wire. Then I pulled out my phone and triggered a factory reset command, locking the system's administration rights behind a 256-bit encryption key that only I possessed. The entire house went digitally dark. The smart locks, the heated floors, the security cameras, the automated boiler system, all of it was now essentially a useless brick of metal and glass. I closed the panel and walked back out to the driveway, empty-handed. Julian looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and triumph. "No tools." "Julian," I asked, stopping right in front of him. "I just wanted to say goodbye to the place. Enjoy the house. I really hope the heating system does not malfunction on you. This Chicago winter is going to be brutally cold." Julian scoffed, waving me off. "Get off my property, Valerie." I got back into my car and drove away. I did not look back in the rearview mirror at Desiree, clutching my grandmother's scarf. 2 blocks down the road, I pulled over into the parking lot of a quiet strip mall. I turned off the engine and picked up my encrypted tablet. My hands were not shaking. I was operating with absolute crystalline focus. Julian thought he had ruined me. He thought his little church board maneuver made him untouchable, but I knew something he did not know. I opened a secure terminal on my tablet and launched the backdoor program I had embedded into his wealth management firm's servers during my audit. The interface glowed in the dim light of my car. I bypassed his secondary firewalls and pulled up the raw data on the $2 million he had wired into Desiree's offshore account. I traced the origin of the funds line by line, shell company by shell company. Julian had told the church he was a financial genius, investing high-yield corporate accounts. But the digital ledger told a very different story. The original routing numbers did not belong to tech startups or hedge funds. They belonged to a network of dummy corporations flagged by federal databases. I stared at the screen as the final puzzle piece clicked into place. Julian had not just embezzled money from wealthy corporate clients. He had stolen $2 million from a front company operated by one of the most ruthless cartels operating out of the Midwest. Julian was not a financial genius. He was a desperate man drowning in toxic debt who had stolen cartel money and was using my parents' church to hide it. He evicted me because he needed the equity of my house to cover his tracks, before the cartel realized their money was missing. A cold smile spread across my face. Julian and Desiree thought they had stolen my sanctuary. They had no idea they had just locked themselves inside a cage with a target on their backs. I closed my tablet, the glow fading into darkness. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception. It was time to show them how a real machine operates. Sunday morning arrived with the heavy ringing of church bells. I stood in the back of the massive sanctuary of the megachurch my parents had built from the ground up. The building held 5,000 people, a sprawling monument to my father's charisma and my mother's obsession with public image. The stained glass windows cast colorful shadows across the velvet pews, but the light felt cold to me. I had grown up in these aisles, forced into ruffled dresses, paraded around as the pastor's perfect daughter, until I grew a spine and refused to play the game. Today I was not here to pray. I was here to deliver a revelation. I slipped into a pew near the back, keeping my posture straight and my expression carefully neutral. I had a clear view of the VIP section at the very front. My mother Beatrice was seated in her usual spot of honor, wearing a tailored cream suit and a matching fascinator that caught the bright stage lights. Pastor Calvin stood at the crystal pulpit, his booming voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. He was currently delivering a passionate sermon about the power of grace, forgiveness, and the beautiful rewards of a faithful life. Naturally, he used Julian and Desiree as his primary examples of divine blessing. They sat right in this front row, basking in the attention of 5,000 devoted members. Julian was playing the role of the benevolent, wealthy white husband to absolute perfection. He wore a crisp navy suit, nodding solemnly at my father's words, looking every bit the generous financial savior the church board believed him to be. Desiree sat beside him dressed in a modest floral maternity dress. She had her eyes closed, her hands raised in apparent worship, swaying gently to the organ music. The entire congregation looked at them with pure adoration, blinded by the illusion of their perfect, respectable lives. "Look at this beautiful couple," my father preached, wiping sweat from his brow with a monogrammed handkerchief. "The Lord is bringing new life into our sanctuary. He is blessing our expansion, providing the resources we need to grow our ministry. Let us thank God for the generosity of our new church treasurer and his lovely bride-to-be." The congregation erupted into applause. Desiree stood up to receive the praise. She pressed one hand to her chest in a display of overwhelming humility. As she reached into her designer clutch to retrieve a tissue, her hand miraculously fumbled. A large, glossy sonogram photo slipped from her fingers and fluttered down, landing perfectly face-up in the center aisle. It was a masterclass in theatrical manipulation. Several church ushers scrambled to pick it up, murmuring words of blessing as they handed it back to her. My mother cooed loudly from the front row, praising the miracle child that was destined to bring so much joy to their family. I watched the sickening display of fake piety from the back row, my face set like stone. The hypocrisy was suffocating, but I did not let it break my focus. The time for tears had passed days ago. Now it was time for the offering. The organ music swelled as the ushers began passing the massive gold offering plates down the aisles. My father reminded the congregation about the new sanctuary building fund, urging everyone to dig deep and give generously. When the head usher reached the front of the altar with the special velvet-lined basket reserved for major donations, I finally stood up. I walked down the long center aisle. The click of my heels against the polished marble floor seemed to cut through the soft hum of the choir. Heads turned as I passed. Whispers rippled through the pews. They recognized the disgraced biological daughter, the bitter ex-wife who had supposedly tried to ruin her foster sister's happiness. My mother's eyes widened in horror. My father gripped the edges of the crystal pulpit, his knuckles turning white, as he silently glared at me, begging me with his eyes not to cause a public scandal. Julian stiffened his arm, dropping from Desiree's shoulders. Desiree clutched her fake sonogram to her chest, looking like a deer caught in headlights. I ignored all of them. I walked straight up to the altar, stopping right in front of the gold offering basket. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a sleek silver USB drive. I held it up for a brief moment, letting the stage lights catch the metal before dropping it directly into the basket. The small clink sounded like a gavel falling. I stepped up to the edge of the altar, leaning just close enough to the pulpit microphone so that my voice would carry over the entire sanctuary. "A special donation from Julian." I announced, my voice cold, clear, and perfectly amplified. My father signaled the security team to remove me, but he was far too late. I did not need anyone to plug that USB drive into a computer. It was nothing but a physical prop. My actual weapon was already deployed. Before walking into the building, I had used my encrypted tablet to breach the church's audiovisual network from the parking lot. I tapped a hidden command sequence on my smartwatch as I stepped back from the microphone. Instantly, the massive projector screens suspended above the choir loft flickered. The digital display of hymn lyrics vanished. A loud, harsh burst of static blasted through the speakers, cutting off the organist mid-chord. 5,000 people gasped as the screens flashed to life. It was a crisp, high-definition hidden camera video taken inside my former kitchen. The timestamp glowing in the corner proved it was recorded just 1 month ago. The congregation stared in shocked silence at the massive image of Julian. He was leaning against my marble countertop, pouring himself a heavy glass of scotch, his tie undone and his collar open. He was clearly intoxicated, slurring his words as he laughed at something off camera. "You really have to hand it to Calvin." Julian's voice boomed through the church speakers, echoing off the high ceilings. "The man is a complete gullible fool. He is so desperate for a shiny new building and a wealthy white son-in-law that he practically handed me the keys to the kingdom." Desiree's voice giggled from the background of the video, though she remained off-screen. Julian took a long swallow of his drink and smiled directly into the hidden lens. "It is almost too easy." Julian continued, mocking the very people who were now watching him in horrified silence. These sheep hand over their hard-earned paychecks every single Sunday. They empty their pockets for a sanctuary fund while they can barely afford their own rent. And Calvin just lets me manage it all. I can skim off the top funnel, it right out the back door, and he just smiles and shakes my hand. These people are pathetic. The blatant disrespect, the absolute dripping arrogance, and the casual racism of his words washed over the congregation. The silence in the sanctuary shattered. It was replaced by a deafening roar of absolute outrage. 5,000 people erupted into chaos. Church mothers shrieked in horror. Deacons jumped out of their pews, pointing furiously at the front row. The ushers who had been rushing to remove me froze in their tracks, staring in disgust at the man they had just been praising. Beatrice dropped her lace fan. Her face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray as she looked at her prized son-in-law. Pastor Calvin stood paralyzed behind his pulpit. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His grand, respectable reputation was dissolving into ash right in front of his eyes. Julian leaped out of his front row seat, his face flushed purple with panic. He screamed at the audiovisual booth to cut the feed, waving his arms frantically, but I had permanently locked them out of the mainframe. The video simply looped, playing his cruel, mocking laughter over and over again. Desiree shrank down in her seat, trying to hide her face behind her hands. She began sobbing loudly, but this time the tears were completely real. There was no sympathy left for her in that room. The glaring eyes of the entire congregation bore down on them, radiating pure, unadulterated fury. They were trapped in a cage of their own making. I did not stay to watch them burn. I simply turned my back on the altar, walked calmly down the center aisle, and left the church as the shouting reached a fever pitch. By 8 a.m. Monday morning, my corporate bank accounts were completely frozen. An hour later, an urgent courier delivered a notice of an immediate comprehensive IRS audit targeting my cybersecurity firm. Julian had not wasted a single minute. He had tapped into his elite network of white corporate connections, leveraging the country club relationships and golf course handshakes he prized so highly to systematically dismantle my financial life. He wanted to ensure that by the time the church scandal hit the morning gossip mill, I would be too desperate to defend myself. My phone rang just as I finished reading the audit notice. Julian's name flashed on the screen. I answered, keeping the line silent. "You do not mess with my world, Valerie." Julian gloated, his voice dripping with the arrogant satisfaction of a man who believed he had just crushed an insect. "You thought embarrassing me in front of those religious zealots would change anything. You are broke. You are homeless. Your business is under federal investigation. You are going to sign that house over to me today, or I will make sure you never work in the tech sector again." I disconnected the call without saying a single word. Panic was a luxury I could not afford, and an emotion I refused to give him. Instead, I took an Uber directly to Ms. Harper's law office. She was already pacing behind her heavy oak desk when I arrived, two phones buzzing simultaneously on her credenza. "They moved fast," Ms. Harper said, dropping a thick file onto the desk. "He used his connections at the Regional Banking Authority to flag your accounts for suspicious activity, tying it back to the audit. It is completely baseless, but it will take months to untangle legally. We need an injunction, but with his network." I held up my hand, stopping her. "I do not need an injunction, Ms. Harper. I need 30 minutes and your secure Wi-Fi network." I pulled my encrypted laptop from my bag, bypassing the standard firewalls and dropping straight into the deep web. Julian thought he was dealing with a standard corporate target. He forgot that I built security grids for a living. I did not just audit systems, I knew exactly how to dismantle them. I started by tracing the specific IP addresses that had generated the suspicious activity flags on my bank accounts. Julian had not been careful enough. He had used a proxy server, but the routing sequence was sloppy, typical of a wealth manager who thought he understood technology better than the engineers who built it. I stripped away the proxy layers in under 10 minutes, revealing the origin point. It traced right back to Julian's personal network terminal at his firm. But I did not stop there. I went deeper, slipping through the digital backdoor I had created during his firm's security audit. If he wanted to play financial roulette, I was going to see all his cards. I pulled up his personal financial records, bypassing the polished summaries he presented to the church board and diving into the raw, unedited data. What I found made me stop and let out a short, harsh laugh. Ms. Harper leaned over my shoulder, staring at the cascading lines of data on my screen. "What is it?" she asked, her voice dropping to a serious whisper. "He is bankrupt," I said, pointing to a series of massive negative balances hidden behind shell company ledgers. "Julian does not have a dime to his name. He has completely leveraged every asset he has." I continued digging, piecing together the timeline. Julian had made a series of catastrophic investments 2 years ago, losing millions of his clients' money. To cover it up, he had borrowed heavily from a shadow lender linked directly to the cartel I had uncovered the day before. The interest rates were astronomical, and the collection methods were notoriously brutal. He needs the sanctuary fund. I realized the pieces clicking together with terrifying clarity. The $500,000 he promised the church was a smokescreen. He is trying to gain full control of the church's entire real estate portfolio to liquidate it and pay off the cartel before they come for him. That is why he needed my house. He needs tangible assets to leverage immediately. Ms. Harper straightened up, her eyes narrowing. He is cornered, and a cornered man with that kind of debt is incredibly dangerous. "We need to take this to the feds right now, Valerie." I shook my head, my fingers flying across the keyboard. "Not yet. If we go to the feds now, he might find a way to wriggle out or pin the blame on my parents. I want him completely exposed. I want to see exactly where every single stolen dollar went." I began tracking the microtransactions, the small consistent payouts that Julian had desperately tried to scrub from his primary ledgers. Amidst the massive wire transfers to offshore accounts and cartel holding companies, a recurring pattern caught my eye. Every month for the past 6 months, Julian had authorized a $5,000 payment to a discreet medical clinic located on the outskirts of the city. The clinic was not registered with major insurance networks, and its digital footprint was intentionally obscured. "Why is he paying an underground clinic?" I muttered, running a trace on the clinic's corporate registration. It was listed under a dummy corporation that specialized in discreet, high-end medical services for clients who demanded absolute anonymity. I ran a search query within the clinic's intercepted data stream, cross-referencing the transaction dates with Julian's schedule. The encryption was tough, but I cracked the primary database just enough to pull the client manifest associated with the routing numbers. The screen refreshed, displaying a single patient name linked to Julian's monthly payments: Desiree Washington. My foster sister's name sat glaringly on the screen, attached to a clinic that specialized in off-the-books medical procedures. I stared at the name, a cold realization settling over me. Desiree was playing the pious pregnant church girl parading her miracle baby in front of the congregation. But miracle babies did not require secret monthly payments to a shady underground clinic. I grabbed my coat and slammed my laptop shut. "Where are you going?" Ms. Harper demanded. "I need to pay a visit to a clinic," I said, my voice hardening, "because I have a feeling Desiree's miracle is about to run out of time." I left Ms. Harper's office without looking back. The sky over Chicago had turned a bruised shade of violet as afternoon bled into early evening. I slid behind the wheel of my car and merged onto the highway, leaving the glittering glass towers of the financial district behind. I drove south, heading deep into the industrial decay of the city, outskirts where the streetlights flickered and the shadows seemed to stretch a little longer. Julian thought freezing my bank accounts would paralyze me. He thought stripping away my money and triggering an aggressive federal tax audit would completely strip away my power. He did not understand that my mind was my true currency, and he had just handed me the digital map to his absolute destruction. The neighborhoods grew progressively worse as I navigated further away from the safety of the corporate center. The manicured lawns and bright storefronts faded into cracked concrete and chain-link fences topped with rusting razor wire. I pulled onto a desolate side street lined with abandoned manufacturing warehouses and overflowing dumpsters. In the middle of this urban decay sat a single squat brick building. Its windows were heavily tinted with security film, and a generic neon sign reading "Urgent Care" buzzed unsteadily over the reinforced steel door. This was the place the offshore accounts had led me to, the shady underground clinic where Julian was funneling thousands of dollars of his stolen cartel money every single month. I grabbed my laptop bag and stepped out into the freezing wind, pulling my heavy wool collar up against the biting chill. I pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped into a waiting room that smelled strongly of cheap industrial bleach and old sweat. The fluorescent tube lights hummed loudly overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over the room. A bored-looking receptionist sat behind a thick panel of bulletproof glass, chewing gum and scrolling mindlessly through a smartphone. I did not walk up to the glass window. I simply took a seat in one of the cracked vinyl chairs in the far corner, blending in perfectly with the handful of nervous-looking people waiting for their names to be called. I unzipped my bag and pulled out my laptop, resting it carefully on my knees. I booted up my system and ran a quick tactical scan of the local area network. It was almost insulting how weak their digital perimeter actually was. The clinic was using a commercial-grade wireless router with a factory default administrator password. They were handling highly sensitive off-the-books medical procedures for desperate criminals and wealthy socialites, but their cybersecurity protocol was practically non-existent. I bypassed their primary firewall in less than 3 minutes. My fingers danced across the keyboard as I deployed a packet sniffer and slipped right through the unsecured backdoor of their central patient database. I bypassed the generic patient records and dug straight into the encrypted VIP files, the ones that required monthly cash retainers to keep completely hidden from traditional insurance networks. I ran a specific search query for Desiree Washington and hit enter. The screen flashed briefly before her entire hidden medical history cascaded down my high-resolution display. I leaned closer, my eyes rapidly tracking the sterile medical diagnostic codes and the detailed physician notes. What I saw made my blood run absolutely cold. Desiree was not pregnant. She was never pregnant. The confidential files detailed a definitive diagnosis of absolute severe infertility, stemming from a chronic medical issue years ago. She was completely incapable of ever carrying a child. I scrolled further down the screen, pulling up the itemized billing receipts attached to her exclusive account. Julian had not been paying for discreet prenatal care. He had been paying for an elaborate, meticulously crafted biological illusion. Desiree was purchasing heavy black market doses of synthetic hormones, specifically human chorionic gonadotropin, and extreme levels of prescription progesterone. She was injecting herself daily to chemically simulate the physical symptoms of a pregnancy, inducing the morning sickness, the hormonal weight gain, and the dramatic mood swings that had completely fooled my naive parents and the entire megachurch congregation. But the cruel deception went even deeper. There were expensive invoices for fabricated ultrasound imagery. The glossy sonogram photo she had so dramatically dropped in the church aisle during my father's sermon was a customized counterfeit purchased directly from this very clinic. I sat there in the sterile waiting room staring at the undeniable digital proof of their sociopathic scheme. Desiree had orchestrated the ultimate emotional con. She had weaponized my parents, blind desperation for a respectable grandchild, and used it to steal my husband and my ancestral home. She had successfully trapped Julian, knowing he was a weak, desperate man, eager to play the wealthy corporate provider. And Julian, the brilliant financial treasurer, was bleeding the church accounts dry to pay a violent drug cartel while simultaneously funding a fake pregnancy that did not even exist. They were both parasites feeding off each other and dragging my entire family down into their toxic abyss of lies. I needed physical hard copies of these specific files. Digital data could be wiped, corrupted, or contested in a legal battle. I needed the actual paper evidence in my hands. I mapped the clinic's internal hardware network and located the primary laser printer sitting directly behind the receptionist's desk. I quickly formatted the diagnostic medical records, the illegal hormone prescriptions, and the fraudulent sonogram receipts into a single hidden print queue. I waited patiently until the receptionist stood up and walked into the back hallway to file a physical patient chart. The exact moment the thick door swung shut behind her, I executed the remote print command. The heavy commercial printer hummed to life, spitting out page after page of undeniable truth. I stood up from my vinyl chair and walked swiftly toward the glass partition. I reached my arm around the side, pulling the warm stack of papers from the output tray, just as the final page finished printing. I folded the documents sharply and shoved them deep into the inner pocket of my coat. I closed my laptop, slid it into my bag, and turned toward the exit. I pushed open the heavy steel door and stepped back out into the biting Chicago night. The street was completely deserted, the earlier trickle of traffic now entirely non-existent. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and started walking quickly toward where I had parked my car, hidden in the deep shadows of an abandoned textile factory. My low heels echoed sharply against the frozen, cracked pavement. The winter wind howled through the empty industrial alleyways, carrying the metallic scent of impending snow. I was less than 50 feet from my vehicle when two massive figures stepped out from behind a rusted commercial dumpster, completely blocking my path. They were large, intimidating men wearing dark, heavy winter coats, their faces partially obscured by the shadows. Their posture was purely aggressive, silently radiating the kind of professional, practiced violence that undoubtedly belonged to the cartel. Julian was so desperately trying to pay off. I stopped dead in my tracks, my hand instinctively dropping into my bag to search for a weapon. But before I could react, a third figure stepped out from the suffocating darkness of the narrow alleyway. The sickly yellow glow of a flickering street lamp illuminated his face. It was Julian. He looked absolutely nothing like the polished, arrogant white knight who had stood on my manicured front lawn just hours ago. His expensive tailored suit was rumpled, his hair was wildly disheveled, and his eyes held the frantic, dangerous panic of a trapped animal. He took a slow, menacing step toward me, a cruel, desperate smile twisting his features. "You are too smart for your own good, Valerie," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet street. I did not step back even as the two massive figures flanked him, boxing me into the narrow corridor of rusted brick and cracked asphalt. The freezing wind whipped through the alleyway, tearing at my coat. But the real chill came from the absolute desperation radiating off my soon-to-be ex-husband. Julian was cornered, and a cornered man holding onto a fragile house of cards was the most dangerous kind of animal. He closed the distance between us until I could smell the stale scotch on his breath and the nervous sweat soaking through his expensive cologne. "You really thought you could just walk into this neighborhood and poke around my private business, Valerie?" Julian hissed, his eyes darting frantically toward my leather tote bag. He reached out with lightning speed and grabbed my arm, his fingers digging painfully through the heavy wool of my sleeve. "Give me the files right now. Do not play games with me. I know exactly what you just printed out of that clinic database. And if you think you are going to walk out of this alley with my property, you are completely delusional." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm and then looked directly into his bloodshot eyes. I did not struggle, I did not scream for help, because I knew no one in this desolate industrial wasteland would come. I simply stood my ground, staring at him with a calm, detached precision that made him falter slightly. "You do not have any property, Julian," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You have a mountain of toxic debt, a cartel breathing down your neck, and a fake pregnant mistress who is chemically simulating a miracle baby. You are pathetic." His face contorted into an ugly mask of pure rage. He yanked the folded documents from my coat pocket before I could block his other hand, holding the papers up in the dim yellow light of the street lamp like a hard-won trophy. He let out a harsh, jagged laugh that sounded completely unhinged. "You think these papers mean anything?" Julian sneered, waving the clinic records in my face. "You think anyone is going to believe a bitter, barren ex-wife over a respected church treasurer? I have the board eating out of the palm of my hand. I have your father convinced I am the second coming of Christ himself, and by tomorrow morning I will have the federal government convinced that you are a criminal mastermind." He took a step closer, towering over me, while his two hired thugs crossed their arms, their massive frames blocking my only exit toward my car. "I already initiated the IRS audit," Julian whispered, leaning in so close I could feel the heat of his breath. "But that is just the beginning. Valerie, I have my people planting heavily encrypted offshore routing numbers right into the source code of your cybersecurity firm. We are going to frame you for corporate espionage on a massive international scale. When the feds raid your offices tomorrow, they are going to find a trail of stolen data leading straight to your personal servers. You will not just lose your business, you will lose your freedom. You are going to federal prison, and I am going to take every single asset you left behind to pay off my debts. He thought his threat would break me. He wanted to see the terror crack my stoic facade. He wanted me to fall to my knees on the frozen concrete and beg him for mercy, just like he had forced my naive parents to blindly submit to his authority. But Julian fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had married. I never walked into a hostile environment without mapping every single exit strategy. You should really learn to look up, Julian, I said smoothly, my expression completely unreadable. I slowly raised my left hand deliberately, exposing my wrist to the flickering street lamp. I tapped the sleek digital face of my smartwatch, overriding the safety lock and initiating the emergency broadcast sequence I had coded specifically for this exact type of physical confrontation. I did not need a weapon. I had the entire frequency spectrum at my fingertips. The deafening sound of a high-decibel police siren suddenly ruptured the dead silence of the alleyway. It did not sound like a single patrol car. It sounded like a massive coordinated tactical raid converging from every surrounding street. The acoustic wave bounced off the towering brick walls of the empty warehouses, amplifying the blaring alarms, until the ground literally seemed to vibrate beneath our feet. Searing blue and red strobe lights began flashing wildly, reflecting off the frosted windows of the clinic and the rusted metal dumpsters, painting the alleyway in the unmistakable colors of a federal raid. The two cartel thugs did not hesitate. They did not wait to check if the sirens were real or a digital illusion. Men who worked in the shadows did not stick around to introduce themselves to law enforcement. They instantly turned and sprinted down the opposite end of the dark alleyway, melting into the night like ghosts. Julian spun around, wildly, dropping the stolen clinic papers onto the wet asphalt as sheer panic completely consumed his features. He looked at the flashing lights bouncing off the brick walls, and then looked back at me, his chest heaving with terror. He realized he was standing in the middle of a black market medical district holding stolen cartel money, and the police were seemingly seconds away from boxing him in. He abandoned his tough guy routine in a heartbeat. Julian turned on his expensive leather heels and ran, slipping frantically on a patch of black ice, before scrambling to his feet and disappearing into the dense shadows behind the clinic. I knelt down calmly, picking up the scattered clinic files from the frozen ground. I brushed off the dirt, securing the undeniable proof of Desiree's fake pregnancy safely back inside my coat. The deafening sirens continued to wail, masking the screeching of heavy tires as a massive black SUV suddenly tore around the corner, taking the alleyway turn dangerously fast. The vehicle slammed on its brakes, stopping mere inches from where I was standing. The passenger door flew open, revealing Ms. Harper sitting behind the wheel, her face illuminated by the glow of the dashboard navigation system. "Get in, Valerie!" she yelled over the blaring acoustic alarms. I slid into the heated leather seat, slamming the heavy door shut behind me. Ms. Harper hit the gas, reversing out of the alleyway with brutal efficiency before spinning the wheel and accelerating back toward the main highway. I tapped my smartwatch, cutting the audio-visual broadcast sequence. The street instantly plunged back into darkness and absolute silence, the phantom police raid vanishing into the cold night air. "That was entirely too close," Ms. Harper breathed, gripping the steering wheel as we sped away from the industrial district. "I tracked your GPS signal when you went off the grid. Did you get what we need to bury him?" I patted the thick stack of papers inside my coat. "I have the clinic records," I said, staring out the window at the passing city lights. "Desiree is completely infertile. She has been injecting black market hormones to fake the entire pregnancy. Julian is using the church sanctuary fund to pay off the cartel, and he just threatened to frame my firm for corporate espionage to cover his tracks. We have everything we need to dismantle his entire life." Ms. Harper let out a sharp breath, shaking her head at the sheer audacity of the deception. "We need to get this evidence to the federal authorities before his people can plant anything on your servers," she said, navigating the SUV onto the highway on-ramp. "We are going straight to the field office, Valerie. We are ending this tonight." I nodded, leaning back against the headrest, the adrenaline slowly beginning to fade from my bloodstream, leaving a cold, sharp clarity in its wake. I was finally going to tear down the illusion Julian had built. I was going to expose Desiree in front of the entire congregation and force my parents to see the monsters they had chosen over their own daughter. Before I could outline my tactical plan, Ms. Harper's cell phone rang sharply, cutting through the quiet hum of the vehicle heater. It was connected to the Bluetooth audio system, and the caller ID flashing on the dashboard screen showed an unrecognized local number. Ms. Harper tapped a button on the steering wheel, accepting the urgent call. "Harper Law Firm," she answered, keeping her eyes firmly on the road ahead. A frantic voice echoed through the car speakers, a woman gasping for breath and speaking in rapid, terrified bursts. "Ms. Harper," the voice cried out, sounding remarkably like one of the senior choir directors from my parents' church. "You are listed as the emergency legal contact for the family. You need to find Valerie right away." I sat up straight, the cold clarity vanishing as a sudden knot of dread formed in my stomach. "I am right here," I said, speaking clearly into the dashboard microphone. "What is wrong? What happened?" The woman on the line let out a choked sob, the background noise filled with the chaotic sounds of shouting and blaring, hospital monitors. "It is your mother, Valerie!" The choir director gasped, her voice trembling with absolute panic. Beatrice just collapsed in the middle of the church luncheon. She started clutching her chest and she could not breathe. The paramedics just rushed her to the intensive care unit. "Valerie, it looks really bad. You need to get to the hospital immediately." Mrs. Harper slammed her foot on the gas pedal, the heavy engine of the SUV roaring as we merged violently onto the highway heading straight toward Chicago Med. I sat frozen in the passenger seat, staring blindly at the passing streetlights as the choir director's terrified words echoed over and over in my mind. My mother, Beatrice, was a strong, proud woman, a pillar of our religious community who had never shown a single sign of heart trouble in her entire life. But the immense, suffocating stress of the past few days, the explosive church scandal Julian moving into her home, the underlying tension of the cartel threats had clearly pushed her aging body past its absolute physical breaking point. I gripped the thick stack of printed clinic files hidden inside my heavy wool coat, feeling the crisp paper pressing against my chest. This was no longer just a corporate battle about saving my cybersecurity business or exposing a massive financial fraud. This was now a matter of life and death. Julian and Desiree had brought their toxic radioactive poison into my family, and it was literally killing my mother. Mrs. Harper did not say a single word during the agonizing drive. She just kept her eyes locked on the road, weaving through the dense city traffic with ruthless efficiency, running 2 red lights to get us there faster. We abandoned the car in the emergency loading zone, completely ignoring the angry shouts of a hospital security guard, and sprinted through the sliding glass doors. The hospital lobby was a chaotic blur of frantic nurses rolling stretchers and crying families, huddled in waiting areas. But I did not stop to ask the front desk for directions. I knew exactly where the intensive care unit was located. We pushed our way past a group of doctors and rode the elevator up to the 4th floor. The silence between Mrs. Harper and me heavy with unspoken dread. When the metal elevator doors finally slid open, the sterile, sharp smell of industrial antiseptic hit me instantly. But the hallway did not look like a normal medical wing. It looked like a Sunday morning church service transported directly into a hospital corridor. Nearly 24 prominent members of my father's megachurch congregation were crowding the narrow hallway, speaking in hushed, dramatic whispers and blocking the path of the working nurses. I pushed my way through the sea of familiar faces, ignoring their sudden gasps of shock and the harsh, judgmental stares they shot in my direction. I just wanted to see my mother. I was 10 feet away from the heavy wooden door of room 412 when a massive figure suddenly stepped directly into my path, blocking the entrance completely. It was Pastor Calvin, my father's most trusted senior advisor, and the man who had always looked at me with thinly veiled disapproval. He crossed his thick arms over his chest, his dark tailored suit straining against his broad shoulders, and stared down at me with absolute, unyielding contempt. "You are not going in there, Valerie," he said, his voice booming down the quiet hospital corridor, carrying a sickening tone of self-righteous authority. "Step aside, Pastor Calvin," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm but refusing to break eye contact for even a second. "My mother is in that hospital bed, and you have zero legal or moral right to keep me from seeing her." He did not move a single inch. Instead, he widened his stance physically, barricading the door with his entire body. "Your mother is fighting for her life right now because of you," he spat, his eyes narrowing with pure, unrestrained hatred. "She suffered a massive cardiac event, and the doctors do not know if she is going to make it through the night. We are protecting her from the very person who put her in this bed." Before I could process the sheer absurdity of his accusation, a loud, dramatic wail echoed from the waiting area just down the hall. The crowd of church elders parted slightly, revealing Desiree Washington slumped dramatically across 3 vinyl waiting room chairs. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime, clutching her supposedly pregnant belly with both hands while sobbing hysterically into the shoulder of the head usher. The older women of the congregation were hovering over her like a flock of protective birds, patting her back, rubbing her shoulders, and offering her tissues. "Valerie is a monster," Desiree wailed, making sure her voice was loud enough for every single person in the corridor to hear her lies. "She came to the house earlier today and cornered Beatrice. She told Beatrice that she was going to destroy me and Julian. And then she looked right at my stomach and said she was going to brutally kill my unborn baby." Beatrice started clutching her chest the second Valerie made that horrific threat. It was the shock of hearing her own daughter threaten an innocent child that caused the heart attack. She collapsed right in front of me. I stood there in the middle of the sterile hallway, listening to the most unhinged, malicious lie I had ever heard in my entire life. Desiree had not just fabricated a pregnancy to steal my husband, she had successfully weaponized my mother's heart attack to turn the entire congregation into her personal angry mob. I looked around the hallway and saw pure venom in the eyes of the church elders. Women who had known me since I was a little girl in Sunday school were glaring at me as if I was the devil. Incarnate men who had eaten dinner at my parents' dining table were shaking their heads in absolute disgust. They believed every single word falling from Desiree's lying mouth. They genuinely believed I was a violent, jealous ex-wife who had driven her own mother into cardiac arrest over a baby that did not even biologically exist. I felt Mrs. Harper tense beside me, her lawyer instincts kicking in as she prepared to unleash a legal tirade defending my character. But I reached out and gently squeezed her arm, stopping her completely. I did not argue. I did not scream or frantically defend myself because I knew that arguing with religious zealots under the spell of a sociopath was a complete waste of breath. Instead, I stood perfectly still and let my analytical mind take over, scanning Desiree's physical condition with cold, calculated precision. She was crying loudly, but her tears looked forced and dry. What really caught my attention was the heavy, unnatural sheen of sweat coating her forehead and the slight visible tremor shaking her fingers. The air conditioning in the hospital corridor was freezing cold, but Desiree was sweating profusely, a classic side effect of massive synthetic hormone injections rushing through a body unaccustomed to them. Then I noticed her left hand. She was clutching a very specific, expensive brand of electrolyte water, her knuckles white from the intense pressure. She took a long, shaky sip whenever she thought no one was looking directly at her. I took a slow, deliberate step back away from Pastor Calvin and slipped my smartphone out of my pocket, keeping it hidden by my side. I scrolled quickly through my contacts and found the name of Dr. Sarah Lynn, an old college roommate who was currently the chief resident of toxicology on this exact hospital floor. I typed out a rapid text message and hit send. "Check the waiting area outside room 412. I wrote, "Desiree Washington is the one putting on a crying show." steal her water bottle and test the remaining liquid for massive levels of synthetic human chorionic gonadotropin. She is faking the pregnancy. Dr. Sarah Lynn appeared at the end of the long, sterile hallway, pushing a small stainless steel medical cart. Her dark eyes immediately locked onto mine, and she gave a single, barely perceptible nod. She had received my urgent text message, and she understood exactly what needed to be done. I stepped away from the cold hospital wall and walked straight toward the chaotic circle of church elders currently surrounding Desiree and Julian. Mrs. Harper matched my stride perfectly, pulling a thick legal folder from her pristine leather briefcase, her expression hardening into absolute professional ruthlessness. "We are not leaving this floor," I announced, my voice cutting sharply through Desiree's fake theatrical sobbing. "I am legally entitled to be here as her daughter, but more importantly, I have a federal court order that needs to be executed immediately." Pastor Calvin scoffed loudly, taking another physically threatening step forward to block my path, but Mrs. Harper expertly boxed him out, holding up a heavy document stamped with a prominent blue federal seal right in front of his face. "This is a court-mandated health directive," Mrs. Harper stated, her authoritative lawyer voice echoing loudly off the sterile white walls during the preliminary discovery phase of Valerie and Julian's ongoing legal proceedings. We uncovered highly documented evidence of Julian's extensive hidden history with highly communicable sexually transmitted diseases under state health department guidelines and active intensive care unit safety protocols. We are citing direct spousal exposure risks and demanding an immediate panel. I looked directly at Desiree, whose fake dramatic tears had instantly completely vanished, leaving only absolute naked terror painted across her face. The church elders surrounding her gasped, collectively taking physical steps backward. "Since you are openly claiming to be currently carrying Julian's child," I said smoothly, projecting my voice so every single person in the corridor could hear the graphic medical details, "you are legally required to submit to a mandatory health screening right here, right now, to ensure you are not carrying any life-threatening pathogens that could compromise my mother's severely fragile immune system while she fights for her life in the ICU." The entire hallway went dead silent. The older women of the congregation, who had just been comforting Desiree and treating her like a fragile saint, physically pulled away from her, looking at Julian with sudden horrified disgust. A highly respected church treasurer harboring a dark secret history of sexually transmitted diseases was a massive, scandalous revelation they were absolutely not prepared to handle. Desiree scrambled frantically up from the vinyl waiting room chairs, her manicured hands flying defensively over her perfectly flat stomach. "You cannot touch me!" she shrieked, her voice pitching upward into a hysterical, uncontrolled frenzy. "I refuse this completely. You are not taking my blood under any circumstances. I claim religious exemption. You cannot force invasive medical procedures on a devout woman of faith." Julian instantly moved to intercept, stepping aggressively in front of Desiree and puffing out his chest. He was playing the role of the wealthy, protective white husband to absolute perfection, trying to use his country club privilege and corporate arrogance to intimidate the hospital staff into backing down. "This is completely outrageous," Julian bellowed, pointing a trembling, furious finger at Mrs. Harper and then directly at Dr. Lynn. "I will sue this entire hospital network into the ground. I will have all your medical licenses permanently revoked before the sun comes up tomorrow morning. You are maliciously harassing a pregnant woman experiencing severe emotional distress. My wife is a deeply devout woman, and her constitutional religious liberties protect her from this insane witch hunt." Dr. Lynn did not even blink. She simply stood her ground, in her crisp white lab coat, calmly holding a sterile, sealed blood draw kit. "Your empty threats do not override a federal court health directive, sir," she said coolly and professionally. "But if your wife actively refuses the mandatory safety blood draw, she will be permanently barred from this medical floor and forcibly escorted off the hospital premises by armed security immediately." Desiree was visibly hyperventilating, now her eyes darting frantically around the enclosed hallway like a trapped, cornered animal. She clutched her expensive designer water bottle, desperately taking another long, shaky gulp of her hidden synthetic hormone cocktail, trying desperately to steady her violently shaking hands. But her fingers were trembling so aggressively that the heavy plastic bottle slipped completely from her slick grip, falling hard to the linoleum floor and spilling clear liquid all across the shiny hospital tiles. She gasped loudly, lunging forward to snatch it up, but Dr. Lin was significantly faster. The chief resident smoothly scooped up the discarded bottle using a blue latex-gloved hand, deliberately grabbing the plastic rim, where Desiree's saliva and the mysterious liquid had thoroughly mixed. "That is my personal property," Desiree screamed, reaching wildly for the plastic container. "It is classified as medical waste." "Now," Dr. Lin replied sharply, dropping the wet bottle directly into a sterile, sealed biohazard bag hanging on the side of her medical cart. I watched closely as Julian grabbed Desiree's arm, pulling her roughly back toward the elevator banks, whispering furiously into her ear. His face flushed with panic. He knew the walls were rapidly closing in. The church, elders were murmuring anxiously amongst themselves, their previously blind, absolute faith in Julian's flawless moral reputation beginning to severely crack under the heavy weight of the STD court order and Desiree's incredibly bizarre refusal to take a simple routine blood test. Dr. Lin turned her back to the escalating chaos, pulling a rapid diagnostic chemical testing kit from the bottom drawer of her cart. She unsealed a long medical swab and dipped it deeply into the remaining liquid trapped inside. Desiree's discarded bottle, applying the soaked cotton sample directly to a highly sensitive chemical testing strip normally used by the advanced toxicology department. It only took a few tense seconds for the deep chemical reaction to process across the white paper. I stepped much closer to the medical cart, watching the small white strip intently. As the moisture wicked upward, Dr. Lin looked down at the clear results and then looked directly up at me, her expression hardening into absolute uncompromising professional certainty. 0 HCG. Dr. Lin stated, her voice loud and commanding enough to carry across the entire tense hospital corridor. "There are massive traceable amounts of synthetic hormonal compounds floating in this water, but absolutely zero human chorionic gonadotropin. This woman is not pregnant. She has never been pregnant. There is no miracle baby. There is only a cheap chemical trick bought and paid for with stolen money." The collective loud gasp from the gathered church elders sounded exactly like all the oxygen being violently sucked out of the room. Pastor Calvin actually dropped his heavy leather-bound Bible onto the floor, his mouth hanging wide open in pure, unadulterated shock. The older women stared hard at Desiree's stomach and then up at her terrified face. The ultimate religious deception laid completely bare under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent hospital lights. I turned slowly toward Julian and Desiree, feeling a massive surging wave of victorious adrenaline flooding my system. I was finally going to deliver the absolute killing blow. I was going to tell the entire shocked congregation about the underground black market medical clinic, the massive amounts of stolen sanctuary funds, and the highly violent drug cartel Julian had selfishly dragged into our peaceful lives. But before I could open my mouth to drop the ultimate devastating hammer, Julian stepped forward, his frantic panic suddenly and entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating, terrifying smile that made my blood run instantly, freezing cold inside my veins. "You really think you have won today?" Valerie, Julian said, his voice dropping to a chillingly calm, sinister register. He reached his hand deep into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal envelope, holding it up high for the entire shocked hallway to see clearly. "You actually think you can use my hidden debts to completely destroy me. But you are far too late. Your mother already took care of everything for me." He ripped open the heavy paper envelope with a single swift motion and pulled out a single sheet of heavily notarized legal paper, waving it like a victorious flag. "Beatrice did not have a massive heart attack because of anything Desiree said to her," Julian announced, his cruel, mocking voice slicing straight through the silent, horrified hospital wing. She had a heart attack because she just officially signed the entire physical deed to your historical ancestral home completely over to me, and when I finally told her, I was instantly liquidating the property to pay off my aggressive cartel debts tomorrow morning. She realized she had just made her only daughter completely homeless. The heavy silence in the hospital corridor was instantly shattered by the thick legal envelope Julian was waving triumphantly in the air. He did not just stop at claiming my childhood home. He reached deeper into the envelope and pulled out a second stack of documents bound by a heavy brass clip. "This is a fully executed power of attorney," he announced, his voice dripping with an arrogant, sickening venom. "Beatrice signed this yesterday afternoon in the presence of legal counsel. She officially transferred full absolute control of the church's $15 million real estate portfolio directly to Desiree and me." Pastor Calvin stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck, his massive frame suddenly looking incredibly small and frail against the sterile walls. The church elders who had just been glaring at me with pure hatred were now staring at Julian in absolute, unadulterated horror. $15 million represented generations of tithes, weekly donations, and community sacrifice. It was the entire operational foundation of the megachurch, and Julian had just legally hijacked every single penny of it. "You cannot do this, Pastor," Calvin stammered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "That money belongs to the congregation. It belongs to the Lord and to the community we built over decades of hard work." Julian let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed horribly against the closed doors of the intensive care unit. "It belongs to whoever holds the legal authority, Pastor, and right now, that is me." He stepped forward, shoving the thick legal document directly into Pastor Calvin's face. "Read the signatures yourself. Your precious Beatrice willingly signed over the deed to the main sanctuary, the community outreach centers, the youth ministry buildings, and the private pastoral residences. She gave me the keys to the entire kingdom because she believed I was the only man righteous enough to protect her legacy, while her own daughter tried to desperately destroy it." Julian was practically vibrating with manic energy, the kind of terrifying high that comes from a desperate man who believes he has just cheated death. The cartel would get their money, and Julian would walk away, completely unscathed, leaving the church completely bankrupt and hollowed out. The complete shift in Desiree's demeanor was absolutely terrifying to witness. The second Julian revealed the power of attorney, the frantic, terrified woman clutching the biohazard bag completely vanished. She stood up straight, dropping the pathetic weeping victim act entirely. She walked over to Julian, wrapping her arm around his waist and leaning against his expensive suit. Her face contorted into a cold, calculating smirk that made my stomach churn. She looked at the devastated church elders and then turned her dark, venomous eyes directly onto me. She was no longer the pious, pregnant church girl. She was a vicious parasite who had just successfully consumed her host and was now proudly displaying the bloody remains for everyone to see. "Checkmate," Desiree whispered, but the harsh acoustics of the hallway carried her malicious voice straight to my ears. "We own everything, Valerie. Your childhood home, your family legacy, the church your mother built from the ground up. It all belongs to us. Now, you thought you were so incredibly smart tracking us down and hacking into that clinic, testing my water bottle like some kind of corporate spy. But you were too busy playing detective while we were playing Monopoly. We own everything, and you own absolutely nothing. You are going to walk out of this hospital with the clothes on your back and watch us liquidate your entire history to fund our new life." She practically purred the words, leaning into Julian as if they were an unstoppable power couple standing on top of the world. The elders began to murmur in panicked, chaotic whispers, realizing that the woman they had anointed as a living vessel for a miracle was actually a ruthless grifter, preparing to sell their spiritual home to the highest bidder. "Pastor." Calvin looked like he was about to physically collapse, clutching his chest as the reality of his own blind foolishness finally settled over him. Mrs. Harper shifted tensely beside me, her brilliant legal mind already calculating the years of agonizing federal litigation it would take to untangle a notarized power of attorney signed by my mother before her cardiac event. She placed a steady hand on my back, bracing herself for my emotional collapse. But I did not scream. I did not cry or lunge across the hallway to rip the documents out of their hands. I simply stood there, letting the sheer magnitude of their arrogant deception wash over me. I kept my eyes completely locked on the crisp white papers clutched in Julian's fist. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, ignoring the gasps of the church elders and the aggressive posturing of Pastor Calvin. I looked closely at the heavy brass clip binding the pages together, and then my eyes drifted down to the bottom corner of the visible signature page, where the official legal stamps rested. Julian was so blinded by his own greed and his desperate, frantic need to pay off his violent cartel debts that he had not bothered to look at the finer details. He only saw the legal authority. He craved to save his own skin. He did not see the tiny, intricate flaws in the dark blue ink pressed into the heavy parchment paper. I stared at the raised, embossed stamp sitting right next to my mother's. Elegant, flowing signature. I knew the official state notary seal intimately because my firm had audited the state registry network 2 years ago, evaluating their security protocols. The seal on Julian's document was visually flawless at first glance, but the registration serial number stamped beneath the crest was missing a specific encrypted sequential digit that the state had implemented only 6 months ago. The power of attorney was a complete, highly illegal forgery. But as I looked at my mother's undeniable, authentic signature resting perfectly beside the fake seal, a cold, terrifying realization washed over me. My mother had willingly signed a fraudulent document. She was a brilliant, meticulous woman who never signed anything without her own legal team reviewing every single syllable. She knew exactly what Julian and Desiree were trying to do, and she had knowingly given them a weapon that would trigger an automatic federal felony charge the second they tried to execute it at a bank. She had anticipated their greed and used it to weave a masterful snare. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face as I realized Beatrice had not been a victim. Driven to a heart attack by stress, she had set the ultimate lethal trap, and Julian had just eagerly stepped right into it. I turned on my heel and walked away from the intensive care unit, leaving Julian and Desiree basking in the glow of their imaginary victory. Mrs. Harper hurried behind me, her professional composure masking the intense confusion radiating off her, as soon as the heavy metal elevator doors slid shut, blocking out the arrogant sound of Julian's voice. She turned to me, demanding to know why I had simply smiled at the destruction of my family legacy. "I did not lose my mind, Mrs. Harper," I explained, keeping my voice low as the elevator descended toward the lobby. "That power of attorney Julian is clutching is a completely fraudulent document. The state notary seal stamped next to my mother's signature is missing. The encrypted sequential digit implemented specifically to catch financial crimes like this, but the signature itself was absolutely authentic. My mother knowingly signed a legally rigged document. She deliberately handed Julian a loaded gun designed to blow up directly in his face the second he tried to pull the trigger." Mrs. Harper stared at me, her brilliant legal mind instantly calculating the sheer strategic brilliance of what my mother had just orchestrated. Beatrice was not a helpless victim. She was a tactical genius playing a deadly game. But we needed to know exactly what her endgame was, and we needed to find out right now. While Julian and Desiree were distracted at the hospital, parading their fake dominance in front of Pastor Calvin and the terrified church congregation, we sprinted out of the crowded hospital lobby and jumped back into the black SUV. Mrs. Harper threw the vehicle into drive and sped aggressively toward my parents' sprawling historic estate in the wealthy suburbs. The dark city streets blurred past the windows as my mind raced through 1,000 different possibilities about what my mother had been secretly planning. We pulled up to the massive brick house and found it completely dark. The manicured lawn bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. Julian and Desiree had clearly rushed to the hospital in a state of absolute frantic panic, leaving the property empty and unguarded. I bypassed the front security keypad using the manual override code my mother had given me years ago and pushed open the heavy oak front door. The inside of my childhood home felt entirely violated. The sickening scent of Julian's expensive cologne lingered in the grand foyer, and a massive pile of Desiree's online shopping boxes were stacked carelessly against the mahogany staircase. I felt a surge of absolute disgust, seeing the prenatal vitamin bottles Desiree had strategically placed on the kitchen island, a physical prop meant to sell her unhinged biological lie to my aging mother. But I did not have time to focus on the anger I needed to find Beatrice's private study before anyone realized we were gone. My mother's study was located at the extreme end of the long upstairs hallway, a room she treated with absolute reverence and kept meticulously organized. No one was ever allowed inside without her explicit permission, not even my father. When he was alive, I pushed the heavy wooden door open and hit the light switch, revealing walls lined with floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelves and a massive antique writing desk. The space looked entirely undisturbed. Julian was far too arrogant to actually search through my mother's complex filing systems. He honestly thought he had already won the war just by bullying an old woman into signing a single piece of paper. I walked slowly around the room, running my hands over the polished wood of the desk, looking for any sign of a hidden plan. My mother was a fiercely intelligent woman who prepared for every conceivable disaster. She would never execute a high-stakes legal trap against a violent cartel associate like Julian, without leaving a clear, undeniable trail of breadcrumbs for me to follow. I closed my eyes and tried to think exactly like Beatrice. My gaze drifted toward the massive oil painting hanging directly behind her writing desk. It was a towering portrait of my grandfather, a stern, unyielding man who had built the church congregation from absolutely nothing. When I was a very little girl, my mother used to hide my most valuable birthday presents in a wall safe she claimed was guarded by his watchful eyes. I stepped behind the heavy desk and grabbed the ornate gold frame of the painting, pulling it firmly to the right. The heavy canvas swung open silently on hidden brass hinges, revealing a sleek, modern digital keypad embedded directly into the thick plaster wall. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I stared at the glowing blue numbers. Julian would have never known about the existence of this safe. And even if he did, he was far too self-absorbed to ever guess the correct passcode. I raised my trembling hand and punched in my own birth date, followed by the exact year my mother had founded her very first charity organization. The small light on the keypad flashed brilliant green, and the heavy steel door clicked open with a quiet, mechanical hum, breaking the absolute silence of the empty house. I reached my hand into the dark cavity of the hidden safe and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was sealed with dark red wax and had my name, Valerie, written across the front in my mother's elegant, unmistakable, flowing cursive handwriting. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tear the thick paper open. Mrs. Harper stood silently in the doorway, acting as a lookout, her sharp eyes scanning the dark hallway to ensure Julian had not sent anyone back to the house to retrieve his things. I tipped the heavy envelope upside down, and two distinct items slid out onto the polished wooden desk. The first was a massive stack of heavily bound legal documents, featuring real authentic state notary seals and the signatures of 3 different federal judges. The second was a long, handwritten letter, spanning 3 full pages of my mother's expensive personal stationery. I picked up the letter, holding it up to the warm light of the desk lamp, and began to read. The ink was fresh, the words written with a steady, unwavering hand. "My dearest Valerie," the letter began, "I know you are reading this because my physical body finally gave out under the immense pressure. But you must understand that my mind has never been sharper. I am not the foolish, naive old woman that Julian and Desiree believed me to be. I have known for months that your husband was a parasitic fraud. I hired my own private investigators the very moment he started asking suspicious questions about the church sanctuary fund. They uncovered the violent cartel debts, the offshore bank routing numbers, and the massive web of financial deceit he was weaving behind your back. I read the words in absolute stunned silence, the breath catching in my throat. My mother had been playing the role of the submissive religious victim entirely to keep Julian completely off guard. She had let him move into her house simply to monitor his every single move from the inside out. And as for Desiree, the letter continued her elegant handwriting, growing sharper and more aggressive on the page. I knew from the very first afternoon she walked into my kitchen that she was an absolute biological fiction. I had her discarded coffee cups secretly tested weeks ago. I knew she was pumping her body full of synthetic hormones to fake a pregnancy and manipulate my faith. She thought she could use the sacred word of God to steal my family legacy, but she severely underestimated a mother's wrath and the lengths I will go to protect my daughter. I reached the final paragraph of the letter, my eyes scanning the words so fast my brain could barely process the absolute magnitude of what Beatrice had done. The realization hit me with the force of a speeding freight train, completely recontextualizing the entire hospital confrontation and the fake power of attorney. I had to make them think they had won. Valerie. The letter concluded. I had to make Julian so desperate and so utterly confident in his ultimate victory that he would take that specific document directly to the cartel to pay off his aggressive debts. But you need to look at the second stack of legal papers in this envelope because the power of attorney they forced me to sign yesterday afternoon is absolutely not for the church's $15 million real estate assets. I legally transferred those assets into an irrevocable blind trust 3 weeks ago. The document Julian is currently holding gives him full legal ownership of something far more dangerous. I placed my mother's handwritten letter down on the pristine surface of the antique writing desk and reached for the second stack of legal documents. My hands were moving with a frantic, desperate energy as I broke the heavy wax seal and spread the thick parchment papers across the polished wood. Mrs. Harper stepped up right beside me, her eyes tracking the complex legal jargon with absolute laser precision. The documents were a masterful, terrifying labyrinth of corporate restructuring and blind trusts. Beatrice had not just blindly signed her name to a piece of paper to appease a greedy parasite. She had spent the last 3 months secretly severing the physical church properties, the $15 million real estate portfolio, from the original holding company that Julian managed. I read the transfer deeds in absolute awe, realizing that the sanctuary, the community centers, the pastoral residences, and the youth buildings were now safely locked away behind a completely impenetrable legal fortress, managed by an anonymous board of directors located 3 states away. Julian thought he was inheriting an empire, but he was actually inheriting a graveyard. I scanned the itemized financial ledgers and felt a cold, sharp laugh bubble up in my throat. The sheer, brilliant ruthlessness of my mother's strategy was laid bare in columns of black ink. Beatrice had intentionally hollowed out the original shell corporation and purposefully loaded it with every single toxic liability Julian had ever brought to our doorstep. She had formally registered the massive IRS tax penalties, the fraudulent offshore routing numbers, and the incredibly aggressive cartel debts directly into the structural DNA of the remaining holding company. She had essentially built a $15 million ticking time bomb, wrapped it in a pretty little bow, and handed it directly to the man trying to destroy her family. That power of attorney Julian was waving around the hospital hallway like a golden ticket did not give him access to the church's massive generational wealth. It did the exact opposite by signing that heavily notarized document. Julian and Desiree had legally declared themselves the sole ultimate guarantors of a $15 million radioactive debt. They had completely bypassed any corporate liability shields and assumed direct personal responsibility for the stolen money they had enthusiastically signed away. Their lives, their freedom, and their physical safety to both the federal government and the criminal underworld. and they had done it all while smiling and thinking they had successfully outsmarted an old widow. The sheer magnitude of my mother's sacrifice hit me so hard my knees actually buckled, and I had to grip the edge of the heavy oak desk just to remain standing. The air in the private study suddenly felt incredibly thin, as the devastating reality of the past few weeks finally snapped into perfect crystal-clear focus. All those terrible, agonizing days of listening to Beatrice praise Julian at the dinner table, watching her welcome Desiree's toxic presence into her sacred home, feeling the crushing, overwhelming heartbreak of being publicly ostracized and humiliated by my own mother. It had all been a beautifully calculated, flawless illusion. She had pushed me away violently and publicly because she absolutely had to. She needed to create a massive, undeniable public rift between us to completely sever my name and my cybersecurity business from the blast zone she was meticulously building. If she had shown me even a single ounce of motherly affection, if she had let me in on the secret for even a second, Julian would have found a way to use his vicious legal team to tie my corporate assets to his cartel debt. My mother had willingly played the villain, purposefully breaking her only daughter's heart just to ensure I would survive the absolute hellfire she was preparing to unleash on the monsters, trying to destroy our family legacy. She had literally worked herself into a stress-induced cardiac arrest, sitting across from the very people plotting her demise, just to keep them entirely distracted until the trap door swung firmly shut. Mrs. Harper let out a long breath beside me, shaking her head in pure, unadulterated professional reverence. "Valerie," she whispered, her voice thick with absolute awe, "your mother is the most dangerous chess player I have ever seen in my entire life. She did not just beat them, she completely obliterated them. They are holding a legally binding death warrant, and they think it is a winning lottery ticket." I stared down at the documents, feeling a massive surging wave of vindication rushing through my bloodstream, washing away the exhaustion and the lingering terror. The cartel was not going to come after my firm. The IRS was not going to raid my servers. The federal agents were going to follow the paper trail straight to Julian's counterfeit power of attorney, the very document he was currently boasting about to the entire church congregation. The absolute poetic justice of Beatrice's plan was so incredibly sharp, it felt like breathing pure ice. We stood there in the quiet, darkened study, the silence of the massive empty house suddenly feeling less like a violation and more like a sacred monument to my mother's fierce, protective genius. When my smartphone suddenly vibrated in my heavy wool coat pocket, the harsh mechanical buzz shattering the quiet moment. I pulled the phone out and looked down at the glowing screen, the caller ID flashing Julian's name with arrogant entitlement. It was a text message, heavily dripping with his signature brand of toxic narcissistic delusion. He had sent a digital flyer, an overly ornate invitation, featuring a wide-angle picture of my childhood home, the exact historic estate Mrs. Harper and I were currently standing inside. The text below the photo read, "Victory Gala. Tomorrow night at my new estate. Pastor Calvin and the senior elders will be there to hear me officially announce my absolute executive control of the church's future. Now that your mother is permanently out of the way, feel free to stop by, Valerie. You can stand outside in the cold and watch me take everything that ever mattered to you, checkmate." I stared at the glowing digital screen, reading his pathetic, arrogant taunt over and over again. He really believed he had won. He actually thought he had outsmarted 2 generations of strong, fiercely protective women. He wanted a public spectacle. He wanted to stand in front of the people who trusted him and flaunt his stolen power. He wanted me to witness my own absolute defeat in the home I grew up in. I slowly lowered the phone, a cold, dangerous smile spreading across my face as I looked back down at the lethal documents my mother had left behind. I typed out my response, my fingers moving with calm, deadly precision. I would not miss it. I lowered my smartphone and slipped it deep into the pocket of my heavy wool coat, letting the cold, satisfying reality of my message sink in. I looked over at Mrs. Harper and gave her a single sharp nod, signaling that it was time to move. The dark neon lights of the city were bleeding through the heavy drawn curtains of my mother's private study, and we did not have a single second to waste. The sun was going to rise in just a few hours, and tonight Julian was throwing the victory gala of a lifetime. We gathered every single piece of paper from the massive mahogany desk, carefully sliding the fraudulent power of attorney, the fake real estate deeds, and my mother's brilliant handwritten letter back into the thick manila envelope. My hands were completely steady. Now the adrenaline had burned away the initial shock, leaving nothing but a pure, focused state of absolute tactical clarity. Mrs. Harper pulled out her encrypted tablet and immediately started making phone calls to her highest-level contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, people she had worked alongside for decades who handled massive corporate fraud and organized crime syndicates. We walked out of my childhood home, leaving the mountain of Desiree's, shopping boxes, and the lingering, sickening smell of Julian's expensive cologne behind us, forever locking the heavy oak door and stepping out into the freezing Chicago morning air. We drove straight to the Federal Building downtown, the imposing brutalist concrete structure looming over the empty city streets like a silent, untouchable fortress. Mrs. Harper flashed her credentials at the heavily armed security guards, and we were immediately escorted deep into the bowels of the building. We walked down a labyrinth of sterile fluorescent-lit hallways until we reached a secure, soundproof conference room. 2 senior federal agents were already waiting for us, looking sharp and incredibly wide awake, despite the ungodly hour. Agent Carter was a tall, imposing man with a completely no-nonsense demeanor, while Agent Ramirez sat behind a thick metal table, opening a secure laptop. They had been tracking the local cartel activity for months, but they had been missing the vital financial link connecting the street-level violence to the white-collar money laundering operations. I sat down at the cold metal table and pushed the heavy manila envelope directly across the surface alongside a silver decrypted flash drive containing every single piece of digital evidence my cybersecurity firm had quietly compiled over the past 3 months. I did not hold anything back. I laid out the entire intricate web of Julian's pathetic deception, explaining exactly how he had slowly drained his own personal accounts, dry gambling on high-risk offshore investments, before desperately turning to the cartel for a massive loan to cover his devastating losses. The agents scrolled through the files on the flash drive, their eyes widening as they processed the absolute goldmine of evidence I had handed them right on a silver platter. I showed them the exact digital footprints linking Julian's private IP address to the offshore routing numbers. I pointed out the encrypted wire transfers proving he was actively skimming money from the church sanctuary fund, transferring small, undetectable amounts right under Pastor Calvin's nose, and then I pulled out the medical files showing Desiree's completely falsified pregnancy records, detailing how she had paid a black market clinic to generate fake ultrasound images and synthetic hormone prescriptions to manipulate my mother into handing over the keys to the megachurch's real estate portfolio. Agent Carter leaned back in his chair, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. Julian had been so incredibly sloppy, thinking his position as a highly respected church treasurer made him completely untouchable and invisible to federal scrutiny. "You have handed us a perfectly wrapped federal indictment," Valerie, Agent Ramirez said, staring at the screen with intense professional satisfaction. "We have enough evidence right here to lock him away for decades on racketeering and wire fraud charges alone." "But there is a legal catch," Carter interrupted, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the metal table, his face turning incredibly serious. "The power of attorney. Your mother signed, transferring the highly toxic $15 million debt to Julian and Desiree is completely fresh. It is technically a civil matter, right up until the exact moment Julian actively tries to execute it to defraud the cartel and the IRS. If we raid the gala tonight, based solely on these digital logs, he might try to claim he had no idea about the true nature of the documents, or he might try to pin the entire financial collapse on your mother, claiming she tricked him in a state of diminished mental capacity. We need an overt, undeniable public act, Agent Carter explained, his eyes locking onto mine with intense, unyielding gravity. We need Julian to willingly and loudly claim absolute ownership of that specific power of attorney, on the record in front of reliable witnesses. We need him to brag about executing the hostile takeover of the church's assets, so that when the financial bomb detonates, he cannot deny he was the sole architect of the entire transaction. If you can get him to admit to executing that document on the microphone tonight, in front of the entire congregation and his cartel associates hiding in the crowd, we will have our tactical strike team waiting in the wings. We will raid the estate and arrest them both on the spot for federal conspiracy and wire fraud, shutting down the entire operation before he can touch a single penny of the actual church money. I looked at Mrs. Harper, who gave me a firm, confident nod, and then I looked back at the federal agents, feeling a dark, thrilling smile curve across my face. Julian was a raging narcissist who thrived on public adoration and the complete humiliation of others. He was hosting a victory gala in my childhood home, surrounded by the church elders who thought he was a savior. Getting him to brag about his stolen empire on a microphone would be the easiest thing in the world. "I accept the terms," I said, my voice echoing smoothly in the cold concrete room. "Have your strike team ready at the front gates by 8 o'clock tonight. I will give you your confession." We walked out of the federal building as the early morning sun began to bleed over the Chicago skyline, painting the towering glass skyscrapers in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Mrs. Harper offered to drive me back to my apartment so I could finally get some rest before the gala. But I shook my head. I did not need sleep. I needed armor. Julian and Desiree had spent the past month painting me as a bitter, jealous, unhinged monster. They had successfully convinced my parents' congregation that I was a heartless corporate villain, trying to destroy an innocent pregnant woman and a righteous man of God. If they wanted me to be the ultimate villain in their pathetic, delusional fairy tale, I was going to play the part to absolute perfection. I directed Mrs. Harper to the highest-end designer boutique in the Gold Coast district, slipping through the heavy glass doors. The moment they unlocked for the morning, the sales associates rushed forward, eager to help. But I waved them away, walking straight toward the back of the luxurious showroom. My eyes scanned the racks of expensive silk and chiffon until I found exactly what I was looking for. It was a breathtaking floor-length designer gown, completely backless with a dangerously sharp, plunging neckline. But it was the color that mattered most. It was not black or modest or appropriate for a church gathering. It was a brilliant, striking, violent shade of blood red. It was the kind of dress that commanded absolute, unyielding attention. The kind of dress a woman wears when she is about to burn an entire empire straight to the ground. I purchased it immediately, sliding the heavy garment bag over my arm. I was going to walk into my childhood home tonight looking like a walking inferno, and I was going to let Julian hand me the match. The heavy silk of the blood-red designer gown moved like liquid fire against my skin as the black SUV pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates of my childhood home. Mrs. Harper parked the vehicle a block away, remaining in the driver's seat to coordinate with the FBI strike team that was currently staging in unmarked tactical vans just out of sight. I stepped out into the freezing night air, letting the biting wind hit my bare shoulders. The historic brick estate was illuminated by massive industrial spotlights casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured lawns. Julian had spared absolutely no expense for his imaginary coronation. A massive fleet of luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway, and the loud pulsing bass of expensive club music vibrated through the heavy oak front doors. I walked slowly up the stone steps, ignoring the confused stares of the hired valet attendants, and pushed the massive double doors wide open. The grand foyer of my family home had been completely stripped of its sacred warmth and transformed into a tasteless corporate networking event. The room was packed with a bizarre, sickening mixture of two entirely different worlds. On one side stood the elite, wealthy white investors Julian had desperately been trying to court for years. wearing custom-tailored suits and holding crystal champagne flutes, looking around the property like hungry wolves on the other side, clustered the deeply conservative church elders and senior congregation members, looking entirely uncomfortable and deeply out of place amid the flashing strobe lights and secular music. They had been lured here under the false pretense of a spiritual transition, but they were currently serving as nothing more than captive props for Julian's monstrous ego. I glided down the sweeping mahogany staircase, the vibrant red of my dress parting the sea of guests like a sharp blade drawing gasps and hushed whispers from the crowd. I had barely reached the bottom step when a high-pitched, artificially sweet voice cut through the heavy bass of the music well. "Look who decided to crash our celebration." I turned slowly, locking eyes with Desiree as she pushed her way through a group of wealthy investors. My stomach physically lurched, not out of fear, but out of pure, unadulterated disgust. She was wearing a vintage emerald green silk dress that I immediately recognized. It was my dress, a custom piece my mother had purchased for me to wear to my college graduation. Desiree had actually raided my abandoned bedroom closets and squeezed her body into my personal clothes just to parade around my house as the new lady of the manor. She stopped right in front of me, aggressively rubbing her exaggerated prosthetic belly with both hands, her eyes practically glowing with malicious delight. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here, Valerie, especially after Julian legally evicted you from this property and took everything your family owned." I did not scream or lunge at her throat. I just let a slow, cold smile stretch across my face as I looked down at the strained seams of the green silk fabric, stretching dangerously over her synthetic silicone. "Bump, you are wearing my old clothes, Desiree," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth conversational whisper that only she could hear. "You are living in my old house, and you are sleeping with my discarded husband. It must be absolutely exhausting, dedicating your entire pathetic existence to being my sloppy second." Her smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine, furious hatred. Her hands freezing on her fake stomach, but before she could snap back, a sudden loud screech of microphone feedback echoed through the grand ballroom, demanding everyone's attention. I stepped around Desiree, completely ignoring her furious sputtering, and made my way toward the center of the massive room. Sitting in a velvet armchair in the darkest corner of the ballroom, looking completely defeated and broken, was Pastor Calvin. His massive, imposing frame seemed to have shrunk. He was staring down at his empty hands, his face etched with the absolute agonizing realization that his decades of spiritual leadership had been hijacked by a ruthless cartel associate. He had willingly handed the keys of his congregation over to Julian because of his own blind, arrogant prejudice against my mother and me. And now he was being forced to sit in the corner and watch his empire be liquidated. He looked up and caught my eye, and for a brief second, I saw pure begging desperation in his expression, but I offered him zero comfort. He was about to get exactly what he deserved. Julian stepped up onto the raised acrylic stage that had been constructed directly in front of my grandfather's antique stone fireplace. He was wearing a crisp white tuxedo jacket, holding a crystal glass of expensive whiskey, and sweating profusely under the bright stage lights. He looked completely drunk, on his own imaginary power, practically vibrating with the manic energy of a man who believes he has just conquered the entire world. "Thank you all for coming out tonight to celebrate the dawn of a new era," he announced, his voice booming aggressively through the massive speakers. "For years, this estate and the megachurch it represents have been mismanaged by outdated leadership." He paused, pointing his whiskey glass directly at Pastor Calvin, who flinched under the public humiliation. "We have allowed tradition to hold back progress, and we have let foolish emotional women dictate our financial future. But that all stops tonight." Julian reached inside his tuxedo jacket and pulled out the thick folded stack of legal documents he had ripped from my mother's hands at the hospital. The elite investors leaned forward, their eyes tracking the paper, while the church congregation murmured in nervous panic. "I hold in my hand a fully executed irrevocable power of attorney," he shouted, waving the heavy parchment paper high in the air for the entire room to see. "I want to be absolutely clear on the record tonight in front of all my partners and investors. I am officially claiming sole absolute ownership and legal authority over the church's $15 million real estate holding company. Beatrice willingly signed this over to me, and I have officially executed the transfer. This afternoon, I am now the sole guarantor and legal owner of these brilliant acquisitions, and we are going to liquidate these massive properties to build an empire that no one can ever take down." He had said it. He had publicly claimed execution of the document into a live microphone in front of 200 witnesses, completing the exact legal requirement Agent Carter needed to launch the federal raid. Julian was grinning wildly, waiting for the thunderous applause of his wealthy investors. But the applause never came. I walked forward, my blood-red gown sweeping across the polished hardwood floor, and marched directly up the 3 short steps onto the acrylic stage. Julian blinked in confused shock as I completely ignored him, walking straight past his podium toward the expensive audio setup tucked behind the velvet curtains. I reached down, grabbed the main thick black power cord connecting the DJ equipment to the house speakers, and ripped it violently out of the wall socket. The pulsing club music and the low hum of the microphone instantly died, plunging the massive ballroom into an absolute dead, terrifying silence. 200 pairs of eyes locked onto me as I slowly turned back around to face my ex-husband, his face suddenly twisting from arrogant triumph to nervous hesitation. Julian read the fine print on page 4. I commanded, my voice cutting through the silent room like a razor blade. Julian let out a sharp, condescending laugh that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom, his voice dripping with the kind of arrogant venom that only a truly delusional man could muster. He looked down at me, standing there in my blood-red gown, and shook his head as if I were a pathetic child, throwing a tantrum at a party. He did not even look at the heavy parchment paper in his hand. He just held it up higher, clutching the microphone tighter in his other hand, telling the silent crowd not to worry, because his ex-wife was simply having a psychological breakdown because she could not handle the fact that she had lost absolutely everything. He smirked at me, his eyes practically glowing with malice, telling me that my mother was a weak, foolish old woman who had handed him the keys to the kingdom, and no amount of dramatic stage crashing was going to change the legal reality of what he possessed. But the room remained dead silent. The elite investors were staring at him with calculating, predatory eyes, and Pastor Calvin was watching from his dark corner, holding his breath. I did not move a single muscle. I just stood there, radiating absolute calm, and repeated my command, telling him to stop stalling and read the fine print on page 4. Julian rolled his eyes dramatically, playing to his captive audience, letting out an exaggerated sigh as he finally lowered the heavy stack of documents. He flipped past the first 3 pages of standard legal boilerplate, the pages that my mother had intentionally left completely normal, just to lull him into a false sense of security. He reached page 4, and his eyes began to scan the dense paragraphs, his confident smirk firmly plastered across his face. But as his eyes tracked back and forth across the black ink, I watched the exact moment his brain finally processed the complex legal labyrinth my mother had built. I watched his arrogant smile physically slip from his face, replaced by a hollow, slack-jawed expression of pure, unadulterated terror. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, chalky white. Under the bright stage lights, his hands began to tremble so violently that the thick pages of the power of attorney fluttered and shook the microphone in his other hand. Picked up his sudden, ragged breathing, broadcasting his rising panic to the entire ballroom. He tried to speak. He opened his mouth to say something to reassure the wealthy investors who were now exchanging very nervous glances, but nothing came out except a pathetic, broken stammer. He backed away from the podium, his eyes darting wildly around the room as he read the words over and over again, desperately hoping his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the ink was completely permanent. He was holding his own financial death warrant. Desiree had been standing right behind him wearing my stolen vintage green silk dress and aggressively rubbing her fake synthetic silicone belly. She did not understand corporate law. She did not know how to read complex financial restructuring documents. She only saw her golden ticket freezing up on stage, looking like a terrified animal while I stood there radiating absolute dominance. Desiree was not going to let me steal her moment of triumph. She lunged forward, pushing Julian aside and violently ripped the microphone right out of his trembling hand. Her face was contorted into a vicious sneer as she glared down at me from the acrylic stage. Breathing heavily and completely oblivious to the radioactive legal bomb her husband was holding. "We own everything!" Desiree screamed into the microphone, her shrill voice echoing harshly against the silent walls of my childhood home. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes wild with greedy delusion. "You are nothing, Valerie. We own the church's land. We own the sanctuary. We own the holding company, and we are multimillionaires. You can wear your fancy red dress and try to ruin our victory gala. But we have won. We beat you and your pathetic mother. We are the new owners of a $15 million empire, and you are going to walk out of those doors with absolutely nothing." I did not flinch. I did not react to her shrill, aggressive screaming. I simply walked up the final step onto the stage, the heavy red silk of my gown trailing behind me like a pool of fresh blood. I walked right up to Desiree, ignoring the frantic, panicked sounds Julian was making behind her. I reached out and calmly wrapped my hand around the microphone slowly but firmly, pulling it from her frantic grip. She was too confused by my absolute lack of fear to resist. I turned away from her and faced the massive crowd of elite white investors and terrified church congregation members who were all holding their collective breath waiting for the final blow. "You do not own any land, Desiree," I said, my voice echoing smooth and deadly across the ballroom, returning the room to absolute silence. "You do not own the sanctuary, you do not own the community centers, and you do not own a $15 million real estate empire. You own a hollowed-out corporate shell company. My mother legally severed the physical church properties from the holding company 3 weeks ago and transferred them into an impenetrable blind trust. The document Julian is holding, the document you both so eagerly signed, does not give you assets. It gives you liabilities. You are now the proud sole legal owners of a corporate entity that currently owes the federal government $15 million in completely unpaid radioactive back taxes." The gasp from the crowd was instantaneous and deafening. The elite investors immediately began backing toward the exits, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a federal tax liability. But I was not finished. I kept the microphone close to my mouth, keeping my eyes completely locked on Julian's terrified, sweating face. "And because you were in such a frantic rush to execute that hostile takeover, Julian," I continued, my voice dripping with cold, calculated venom, "you signed a direct personal guarantee, completely bypassing the corporate liability shield. You did not just inherit $15 million in federal tax debt. You just made yourself completely personally liable for the massive offshore loans you took from the cartel. The money you lost. Gambling is now legally tied directly to your name and your physical safety. You thought you were outsmarting my mother, but Beatrice played the ultimate game of chess by throwing me out of this house. She legally removed me from the blast zone and handed you a bomb that is completely impossible to defuse. You are completely bankrupt. Julian and the people you owe money to are going to bury you." Julian's knees literally gave out. He collapsed onto the acrylic stage, the fraudulent documents scattering across the floor around him. Desiree finally understood what was happening, her hands flying away from her fake belly as a primal scream of pure panic ripped from her throat. The entire ballroom descended into absolute sheer chaos. The wealthy investors were shoving each other to get to the front doors. Pastor Calvin was staring at the stage with his mouth hanging wide open, finally realizing that my mother had saved his church by sacrificing her own reputation. The screaming and the shouting grew to a deafening roar as Julian tried to scramble backward across the floor, away from the documents that had sealed his fate. But the chaos inside the ballroom was suddenly pierced by a sound that cut through the night air like a jagged knife. It started as a faint, distant wail and rapidly amplified into a deafening mechanical scream. A dozen heavy sirens converging on the historic estate from every single direction. The heavy oak doors of the grand foyer flew open, and suddenly brilliant blinding flashes of red and blue light began to paint the massive floor-to-ceiling windows strobing wildly across the walls of the ballroom. Illuminating Julian's terrified face, the federal strike team had arrived, and the real show was just beginning. FBI agents poured through the grand double doors of the foyer like a tidal wave of black tactical gear and heavy armor, their boots stomping against the polished marble floor. In perfect, terrifying unison, the sharp, blinding beams of their tactical flashlights sliced through the dim, atmospheric lighting of the ballroom, pinning the wealthy investors and the panicked church elders against the walls. Like insects trapped under a microscope, federal agents began shouting commands, their voices echoing with absolute authority, ordering every single person in the room to freeze exactly where they were and keep their hands clearly visible. The elite white-collar criminals who had just been eagerly sipping champagne and plotting to divide up my family's stolen empire suddenly dropped their crystal flutes, the expensive glass shattering across the hardwood as they threw their hands into the air, their faces completely drained of all that arrogant, predatory confidence they had been projecting just moments before. The deeply conservative congregation members who had been lured here to bless this fraudulent takeover began screaming and praying aloud, terrified by the sudden invasion of armed federal forces, plunging the supposed holy celebration into an absolute nightmare. Julian was still standing on the acrylic stage, frozen in a state of absolute catatonic horror, the fraudulent power of attorney slipping from his trembling fingers and fluttering to the ground like dead leaves. He looked out at the sea of federal windbreakers swarming his victory gala, and then his eyes locked onto mine, finding nothing but cold, unyielding judgment in my expression. The reality of his $15 million cartel debt and his impending federal prison sentence finally snapped his brain completely in half. A primal, desperate animal panic took over his body. He spun around, shoving past the terrified senior congregation members, knocking over a towering pyramid of expensive champagne glasses that crashed to the ground in a spectacular explosion of glass and alcohol. He sprinted wildly toward the back of the estate, his crisp white tuxedo jacket flapping behind him as he threw his entire body weight against the heavy French doors, shattering the glass panes as he burst out onto the expansive outdoor patio, desperate to escape the consequences of his own pathetic greed. He thought he could escape into the darkness of the sprawling manicured lawns. He thought he could outrun the massive federal trap I had spent months carefully building around him. But Agent Carter had already locked down the entire perimeter of the estate. Heavily armed agents emerged from the shadows of the garden, their flashlights tracking his desperate, pathetic sprint across the imported stone tiles. Julian slipped on a puddle of spilled champagne, his arms flailing wildly as he tried to regain his balance, slipping awkwardly in his expensive Italian loafers. But before he could take another step, a massive federal agent charged out from behind the outdoor bar and tackled him at full speed. The sheer, brutal force of the impact lifted Julian entirely off his feet, sending both men launching straight over the sleek edge of the illuminated infinity pool. They crashed into the glowing blue water, sending a massive geyser of freezing water splashing across the patio. Julian came up gasping and thrashing blindly, coughing up pool water as his expensive custom-tailored tuxedo clung to him like a soaking wet shroud. Two more agents waded directly into the shallow end, grabbing Julian by the collar of his ruined jacket and dragging him roughly up the stone steps, slamming him face first onto the wet patio floor, the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing loudly over his pathetic sobbing. Back inside the grand ballroom, Desiree was completely losing her mind. She watched her entire stolen empire evaporate in real time, and her brain instantly defaulted to the only weapon she had left: her completely fabricated victimhood. She began shrieking at the top of her lungs, a piercing theatrical wail that forced several of the church elders to cover their ears. She threw herself backward against the velvet curtains, clutching her oversized prosthetic belly, with both hands crying hysterically that she was a delicate pregnant woman, that the stress was going to harm her unborn baby, that she was an innocent mother, to be being brutally terrorized by heartless government thugs. She tried to push her way through the line of tactical agents, screaming that she needed a doctor immediately, waving her arms and demanding that the church elders step forward and protect her from this vicious, unprovoked harassment, begging the congregation to shield a righteous pregnant woman from the wicked. Authorities, she realized Julian had been dragged from the pool and tried to run toward the shattered French doors to follow him. Agent Ramirez, a stern, uncompromising female federal agent who had been tracking their financial crimes for months, stepped directly into Desiree's path, blocking her escape route onto the wet stone patio. Desiree shrieked and raised her hand as if she was going to strike the agent, but Ramirez did not even blink. She reached out with lightning speed, grabbing Desiree by the wrist and spinning her around, pushing her firmly against the shattered doorframe. "For a standard security pat down," Desiree screamed. "Bloody murder," sobbing about her fragile pregnancy and the health of her imaginary child. But as Agent Ramirez ran her expertly trained hands down the sides of the vintage emerald green silk dress, her fingers caught the rigid, unnatural edge of the thick silicone molding. Hiding beneath the fabric, Ramirez's expression instantly hardened into pure professional disgust as she realized exactly what she was touching beneath the stolen silk. "Save it for the judge, ma'am," Agent Ramirez said, her voice dripping with absolute glacial contempt. She reached her hands directly under the neckline of my stolen graduation dress, gripping the heavy elastic straps that held the massive prosthetic in place, and yanked them downward with one swift, brutal motion. The thick straps snapped loudly, the emerald silk fabric bunched up, and the enormous flesh-colored silicone bump dropped straight out from under the hem of the dress, hitting the wet stone of the patio floor with a heavy, sickening wet thud. The fake belly rolled slightly across the floor, coming to a dead stop right at the feet of the horrified senior church leadership who had followed her out to the terrace. Desiree froze, her mouth hanging wide open in a silent scream as the dress hung limp and loose over her perfectly flat, completely empty stomach, revealing the absolute monstrous depth of her deception to the entire world. The collective gasp that ripped through the crowd was absolutely deafening. The elite investors stared in stunned silence while the deeply conservative church congregation, the people who had treated Desiree like a blessed saint and shunned my mother as a bitter sinner, stared at the fake silicone belly on the floor with expressions of pure absolute horror. They looked from the prosthetic bump up to Desiree's flat stomach, processing the staggering scale of her deception. Women who had prayed for her safe delivery, men who had donated money to her baby shower, all stood paralyzed by the sickening reality of her lies. Desiree shrank down against the doorframe, covering her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Not out of fear of federal prison, but out of the sheer agonizing humiliation of having her pathetic, fraudulent illusion violently stripped away in front of the exact people she desperately wanted to impress and control. The crowd slowly parted as Julian was dragged back into the ballroom, in handcuffs, dripping wet and shivering violently, whining pathetic apologies to the federal agents who ignored him completely. Standing at the edge of the patio, watching his entire righteous empire burn to the ground, was Pastor Calvin. His massive shoulders were shaking, his eyes darting frantically between the silicone belly resting on the stone floor, the cartel documents scattered across the stage, and Julian crying like a beaten animal in federal custody. The overwhelming, crushing weight of his arrogant judgment finally broke him. He realized in that exact moment that he had thrown away his own biological daughter to protect a pair of ruthless, predatory monsters. He had let his own blind prejudice completely blind him to the terrifying truth of who he had welcomed into his sanctuary, and now his entire life, his legacy, and his congregation were completely destroyed. Pastor Calvin slowly fell to his knees on the cold floor, his legs no longer able to support the absolute agony of his realization. He looked up through the flashing red and blue lights, his face stained with bitter, desperate tears, and reached a trembling, desperate hand out through the crowd directly toward me. Pastor Calvin remained on his knees on the cold, polished hardwood floor of the grand ballroom, the flashing red and blue lights from the federal vehicles outside casting long, distorted shadows across his trembling shoulders. He looked up at me, his face completely shattered, an absolute mask of pure, agonizing regret. The tears streaming down his cheeks were thick and heavy, catching in the fabric of his expensive pastoral collar. He reached out with a shaking hand, his fingers desperately grasping at the empty air between us. Begging me with a broken, sobbing voice to forgive him, he wailed that he had been entirely blind, that he had let the devil into his sanctuary, that he had been manipulated and twisted by dark forces he could not see. He cried out to the silent, horrified congregation surrounding us, trying to garner their sympathy, trying to paint himself as an innocent victim of spiritual warfare who had simply been deceived by a wolf in sheep's clothing. He begged me to take his hand to help him stand back up, to stand by his side, and help him explain to the church elders that this was all just a terrible test of their faith, and that together we could rebuild his reputation and the church's standing in the community. I looked down at the man who had raised me, the man who was supposed to protect me unconditionally, but who had thrown me out onto the street the exact second I became an inconvenience to his pristine public image. And I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no lingering child-like desire for his approval. Just a profound, cold, absolute emptiness. The heavy silk of my blood. Red gowns settled around my feet as I stared into his desperate, weeping eyes, completely unmoving. The massive room held its collective breath, every single church elder and wealthy investor watching to see if the dutiful pastor's daughter would once again sacrifice her own dignity to save her father's towering ego. But the woman who used to desperately seek his validation was dead. Julian and Desiree had killed her, and my father had willingly attended the funeral. "The devil did not deceive you, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the ballroom like a sheet of pure ice carrying absolutely zero emotion. Your own obsession with church respectability. Did you wanted a wealthy, handsome white son-in-law and a picture-perfect, obedient choir director? Daughter, more than you ever wanted, the actual truth you let Julian into your inner circle because he looked the part, because he brought in the kind of wealthy donors you desperately wanted to impress. You traded your own flesh and blood for a front-row seat at a country club. Networking event, you chose public perception over your own child. You sacrificed your family on the altar of your own towering arrogance and corporate greed. He let out a ragged, agonizing sob, his massive frame collapsing even further toward the floor, as my words completely dismantled his pathetic attempt to blame the devil for his own selfish choices. He shook his head wildly, begging me not to say these things in front of the congregation, pleading with me to help him fix the catastrophic damage. But I just slowly shook my head, the cold smile returning to my face. You built your entire ministry on a house of cards. Dad and you handed the match to a degenerate gambler, I whispered. But the acoustics of the silent room carried every single syllable to the crowd. There is no fixing this. There is no rebuilding. The federal government is going to tear your megachurch apart, brick by brick, looking for the cartel money. Julian laundered right under your nose. Your congregation will never look at you the same way again, and I am not going to be your savior tonight. You chose your kingdom over your daughter, and now you get to sit in the ashes of your empire all by yourself. I turned my back on him, leaving him weeping on his knees in the middle of the ruined victory gala. But before I could take a single step, a loud, violent thrashing sound pulled my attention toward the shattered French doors. Julian was actively fighting against the federal agents as they dragged him back inside the ballroom. His expensive custom tuxedo was completely ruined, soaking wet from the infinity pool and clinging to his shivering body, leaving a pathetic trail of chlorinated water across the polished hardwood floor. He saw me standing there, radiating absolute dominance, and his shivering terror suddenly ignited into a rabid, desperate, furious rage. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, thrashing violently against the heavy steel handcuffs that were digging deeply into his wrists, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure narcissistic hatred. He screamed that I had set him up, that I had orchestrated this entire malicious trap, and that he was going to completely destroy me in civil court. He yelled that we were still legally married, that the state recognized our union, and that no matter how many federal agents dragged him away, he was legally entitled to half of my highly successful cybersecurity firm, half of my personal bank accounts, and half of everything I had built since the day we met. He spit venom across the floor, claiming he would hire the most ruthless attorneys in Chicago and drag my name through the mud, tying me up in endless, exhausting litigation until I was just as completely broke and thoroughly ruined as he was. I did not flinch. I did not even bother to respond to his frantic screaming, because I did not have to. From the dark shadows near the main entrance, Mrs. Harper emerged, moving with the absolute calm, terrifying precision of an apex predator. She glided smoothly across the floor, completely ignoring the chaos and the federal agent stepping right into Julian's line of sight. She was holding a single crisp white sheet of paper in her perfectly manicured hand. The federal agents paused for just a fraction of a second, recognizing her authority and letting Mrs. Harper deliver the final fatal strike. She stopped right in front of the thrashing, soaking wet narcissist and held the paper up so it was merely inches from his furious face. While you were spending the past 3 months desperately trying to forge legal documents and impress cartel money launderers. Julian, I said, my voice echoing over his pathetic sputtering. Mrs. Harper was quietly working her absolute magic in the background, leveraging her decades of high-level legal contacts to push our divorce proceedings through an expedited arbitration process entirely in absentia due to your documented ongoing criminal fraud investigations. She handed the paper to one of the federal agents, who held it up for Julian to read. That is a final legally binding divorce decree, signed and sealed by a superior court judge. This morning, leaving you with absolutely zero claim to a single penny of my assets. You do not own my company. You do not own my accounts. You own nothing. You have nothing. You are nothing. The heavy thud of tactical boots echoed through the grand foyer as federal agents continued to flood the property, swarming the massive estate like a perfectly orchestrated army of absolute justice. Julian's pathetic screaming was completely swallowed by the damp night air as he was dragged away, leaving a long, humiliating trail of chlorinated pool water from his ruined custom tuxedo all the way across the imported stone tiles of the outdoor patio. He was still clutching the crisp white divorce decree in his tightly handcuffed hands, sobbing hysterically as the reality of his $15 million cartel debt and his immediate federal prison sentence finally crushed his fragile narcissistic mind into a million irreparable pieces. The grand ballroom of my childhood home was now a chaotic, sprawling crime scene. The elite wealthy white investors, who had been sipping premium champagne just minutes ago, were now lined up against the mahogany paneled walls, with their hands shaking in the air, their arrogant, predatory confidence entirely, completely shattered. Pastor Calvin was still weeping silently on his knees near the cold stone fireplace, a pathetic, broken shell of a man paralyzed by his own righteous ignorance. But I did not spare him or any of them. Another glance. My eyes were locked entirely on Desiree. Agent Ramirez, a cold, uncompromising veteran of the Federal Bureau, was marching Desiree right through the center of the chaotic ballroom, her hands securely fastened tightly behind her back with heavy steel cuffs. The vintage emerald green silk dress that she had so proudly stolen from my personal closet was now hanging off her shoulders in loose, pathetic, sagging folds. The massive silicone belly that had given her so much imaginary, untouchable power was currently sitting inside a clear plastic evidence bag on the patio left behind, like a discarded piece of trash. And without that massive physical lie shielding her, she just looked incredibly small, deeply ordinary, and utterly pathetic. Her heavy theatrical makeup was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks, completely ruining her carefully crafted innocent victim facade. The deeply conservative church elders, who had treated her like absolute royal saintly perfection, for the past 3 months actually stumbled backward as she was paraded past them, refusing to even look her in the eye. Their expressions twisted in absolute pure, undisguised disgust. Desiree tried desperately to keep her chin up, trying to project some final shred of defiant arrogance to protect her shattered ego. But her lower lip was trembling violently as she realized she was going to spend the rest of her miserable life locked inside a sterile concrete federal cell. I followed them at a slow, deliberate, rhythmic pace, the heavy blood-red silk of my designer gown sweeping gracefully across the polished hardwood floors, listening to the sharp clicking of my heels echoing over the low, murmuring voices of the federal investigators. We stepped out through the massive oak front doors into the freezing Chicago night air. The entire circular driveway was bathed in the harsh, blinding strobe of red and blue police lights, painting the historic brick walls of my family estate in alternating flashes of violent, piercing color. It was a breathtakingly beautiful sight, an absolute symphony of pure, flawless justice, unfolding exactly as I had meticulously designed it. The federal agents guided Desiree down the wide stone steps, her bare shoulders shivering uncontrollably in the biting wind, as they approached a heavy black armored police cruiser, idling aggressively near the towering wrought iron front gates. Agent Ramirez opened the heavy rear door of the cruiser and firmly pushed Desiree inside, forcing her to slide awkwardly across the slick, cold vinyl seats in her ruined stolen silk dress. The heavy door slammed shut with a sickeningly final metallic thud, locking her entirely inside the dark, claustrophobic vehicle. The engine was running a low, powerful rumbling hum, vibrating through the driveway. Gravel Agent Ramirez moved to the front seat to coordinate the transport, leaving the rear window rolled down just a few sparse inches to let the freezing winter night air circulate into the back compartment. I walked slowly down the stone steps, completely ignoring the biting, freezing cold against my bare skin, feeling an incredible, radiant, blistering heat burning bright and hot inside my chest. I walked right up to the side of the armored cruiser, the gravel crunching loudly under my expensive heels, and leaned down so my face was perfectly level with the narrow, open crack in the dark-tinted glass. Desiree was pressed back against the heavy metal grating that separated the front and rear compartments of the police vehicle, her eyes red-rimmed, bloodshot, and frantic. She looked through the narrow gap in the window and saw me standing there in the cold, radiating absolute, untouchable, absolute dominance. Her breathing hitched, a fresh, violent wave of panic washing over her ruined face as she realized this was the absolute bitter end of the line. There was no Julian to run interference and protect her. There was no fake miraculous pregnancy to hide behind. There was no Pastor Calvin to blindly champion her fraudulent virtue. She was completely stripped down to nothing but a pathetic, greedy little thief who had foolishly tried to steal an empire from a woman who was born to rule it. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat or scream or mock. Her pathetic streaming tears, I just slowly, deliberately reached my hand deep into the pocket of the heavy wool winter coat that Mrs. Harper had draped gently over my bare shoulders. My fingertips brushed against a small, folded piece of paper that I had been carrying with me in my purse every single day since the absolute darkest, most agonizing moment of my entire life. I pulled it out, holding it up to the narrow crack in the window, so Desiree could see exactly what it was under the flashing police lights. It was a crisp, clean $50 bill. The exact same $50 bill she had arrogantly thrown directly at my chest in the sterile white hallway of the hospital, the day she and Julian had completely ambushed me and practically left me for dead. She had laughed in my face and told me to buy myself a cup of coffee, telling me that I had lost absolutely everything and that I was nothing more than a pathetic minor obstacle, standing in the way of her grand, spectacular delusion. Desiree's eyes widened to the size of saucers as she instantly recognized the bill, the memory of her own staggering, blinding arrogance reflecting right back at her like a mirror in the dark. Flashing police lights, I folded the crisp green bill exactly in half and slipped it neatly through the narrow crack in the heavy bulletproof window, letting it flutter down slowly through the dark, tight space and land directly on Desiree's lap, resting against the sagging fabric of my old silk dress. "Buy some extra commissary snacks?" I said, my voice incredibly smooth and perfectly flat, carrying absolutely zero emotion right through the glass. "I hear federal prison food is terrible." The absolute shock on her face lasted for only a fraction of a second, before the total crushing immense weight of her bleak, horrifying reality finally broke her mind. Agent Ramirez shifted the heavy cruiser into drive and stepped firmly on the gas, the tires crunching loudly and aggressively against the gravel as the massive vehicle began to roll forward down the long, winding estate driveway. Desiree lunged forward against the heavy, reinforced glass, her face contorting into an ugly, terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated terror as she realized she was leaving my beautiful estate forever, completely in handcuffs, with absolutely nothing to her name. A long, piercing, agonizing scream ripped violently from her throat, echoing loudly over the low rumble of the police engine. A sound of pure, total, devastating despair fading slowly into the cold darkness. As the red and blue lights disappeared through the main iron gates and turned onto the empty city street, I stood entirely alone in the freezing driveway for a long, silent, victorious moment, letting the cold, crisp night air fill my lungs completely to the brim. The heavy flashing lights of the remaining tactical vans cast long, dramatic shadows across the perfectly manicured, sprawling lawns. But the oppressive, suffocating, invisible weight that had been hanging over this property for months was completely, entirely gone. The toxic, lingering smell of Julian's cheap cologne, the suffocating, heavy presence of Desiree's false piety, the arrogant, blind entitlement of the church elders. It had all been completely swept away, washed totally clean by the absolute, devastating, unyielding power of my revenge. I slowly turned around, the heavy red silk of my gown wrapping beautifully around my ankles in the wind, and looked up at the massive, towering, majestic facade of my childhood home. The warm, yellow lights were still glowing brightly and perfectly through the tall, elegant glass windows, illuminating the grand foyer where my mother had raised me. The estate was finally quiet. The estate was finally safe. The estate was completely, unequivocally mine again. 6 months have passed since that freezing winter night when the flashing federal lights painted the stone walls of my childhood estate and the heavy, suffocating chains of my old life were finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I am currently sitting in the absolute center of my new ultra-modern penthouse office, resting comfortably in a sleek, ergonomic chair behind a massive slab of imported black marble that serves as my desk, looking out through the pristine floor-to-ceiling glass windows at the sprawling, magnificent Chicago skyline, spreading out below me like a glittering carpet of endless possibilities. The office is a testament to flawless minimalist design, completely void of the tacky, ostentatious garbage that used to clutter this exact same space just half a year ago. Because this corner office, this entire towering glass skyscraper, and the massive lucrative corporate entity that operates inside of it used to belong exclusively to Julian, but when the federal government completely decimated his fraudulent house of cards and seized every single one of his heavily leveraged assets, I swooped in like a shadow and bought his entire firm at the federal liquidation auction for absolute literal pennies on the dollar. I kept the absolute best talent. I fired every single executive who had been complicit in his pathetic cartel schemes, and I rebranded the entire empire under my own name, standing as the unquestioned majority shareholder of the exact same company he once used to make me feel completely small and financially dependent. The sweet poetic justice of my total victory is matched only by the absolute devastating reality of their current miserable existence. Julian and the woman. The entire congregation knew as the pious innocent Desiree, but whose actual legal name was revealed during the sprawling federal indictment, to be Tasha, are currently rotting away in maximum security federal prison facilities, serving out back-to-back 15-year sentences without the slightest possibility of early parole. The federal prosecutors completely dismantled their pathetic defense, tearing through their forged documents and their offshore cartel accounts with brutal mechanical precision. There was no charming their way out of a federal courtroom. There were no gullible church elders sitting in the jury box, ready to swallow their weaponized victimhood. Julian had sobbed uncontrollably during his sentencing, weeping like a terrified child as the judge handed down his heavy, devastating sentence. And Tasha was stripped of all her stolen vintage emerald silk dresses and her heavy theatrical makeup replaced by the harsh, unflinching reality of a scratchy standard issue, orange jumpsuit, and a cold concrete cell. They thought they could outsmart me. They thought they could steal my family empire and leave me with nothing. But now they have absolutely nothing but the crushing, agonizing weight of time slowly ticking away behind thick iron bars. The fallout from that night did not just completely destroy the criminals who tried to steal my life. It also completely severed the toxic, heavy chains that had been slowly suffocating my mother for decades. Beatrice finally opened her eyes to the absolute hollow reality of her marriage, the sheer stress of the hostile takeover, and the terrifying realization that her own husband was perfectly willing to sacrifice their only daughter to protect his precious, fragile public image. Finally broke the spell she had been under for 30 years. She filed for a completely ruthless, uncompromising divorce, leaving Pastor Calvin with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and the ruins of his disgraced reputation. Beatrice has fully recovered from the trauma of that night. She is no longer the stressed, exhausted woman desperately trying to maintain the flawless facade of a perfect pastor's wife. She moved far away to a quiet, beautiful coastal town, completely isolated from the toxic gossiping, judgment of the church community, and she is currently living a peaceful, quiet life on a very generous, completely secure private pension that I personally structure and manage for her, ensuring that she will never, ever have to rely on the financial mercy of a hypocritical, arrogant man ever again. Pastor Calvin was left entirely alone, his massive megachurch completely abandoned by the wealthy elite investors and the loyal congregation members who had watched his entire righteous empire exposed as a pathetic harbor for federal fugitives. He preaches to completely empty rows of dusty wooden pews, a disgraced, broken man totally consumed by his own bitter, agonizing regret, exactly as he deserves to be. I slowly turn my attention back to the massive black marble desk in front of me, resting my hands lightly on the cool, polished surface. Sitting directly in the center of the desk, illuminated perfectly by the natural sunlight pouring in through the skyline windows, is a heavy, thick, black leather presentation folder. I reach out with slow, deliberate, precise movements and flip the heavy leather cover open, revealing a massive stack of crisp white legal contracts. It is the final piece of the puzzle, the absolute ultimate resolution to the nightmare that defined my entire early life. The land that the old church was built on, the massive sprawling property that Pastor Calvin prized above his own family, had gone into severe federal foreclosure. After the cartel debt was fully exposed, I used the massive profits from my newly acquired corporate empire to purchase the entire city block outright. But I am not going to renovate the sanctuary. I am not going to save the stained glass windows or preserve the towering wooden pulpit where so much toxic heavy judgment was handed down week after week. I am going to completely demolish the entire building, tearing it down to the absolute bedrock and completely salting the earth of that hypocritical toxic sanctuary in its place. I am using the property to build a massive state-of-the-art multi-million-dollar STEM academy dedicated entirely to the education and empowerment of young, brilliant Black girls. I am going to fund the next generation of powerful, uncompromising women, ensuring that they have the absolute highest level of education, the strongest technological skills, and the deepest financial literacy, so that they will never ever have to rely on the fake perfection of church respectability or the conditional financial support of weak, arrogant men. They will be completely bulletproof. They will be entirely self-sufficient, and they will rule their own lives exactly the way I rule mine. I reach over and pick up my heavy silver fountain pen, the metal cool and heavy against my fingers. I press the smooth, precise nib against the bottom of the final page of the demolition and construction contract, signing my name with sweeping, sharp, flawless strokes, sealing the absolute destruction of my past and the brilliant, undeniable power of the future. I slowly place the silver pen back down onto the marble desk and reach out, flipping the heavy black leather cover of the folder, completely closed. The sharp, authoritative thud of the folder, shutting echoes cleanly through the massive silent space of my penthouse office. I turn my chair slowly, looking out once more over the vast, sprawling city skyline, stretching out endlessly beneath me, bathed in the warm golden light of the setting autumn sun. And as I look down at the empire I have entirely conquered and reclaimed, I let a slow, chilling, completely satisfied cold smile spread across my face. The profound lesson from this journey is that true power never comes from seeking validation from toxic people or maintaining a fake image of perfection. It comes from knowing your own worth, setting unbreakable boundaries, and quietly building your strength when you stop playing along with their twisted games. Their fragile house of cards inevitably collapses under its own weight. True family will always respect you, and sometimes you must bravely walk away to protect your peace. Share your story of overcoming betrayal in the comments below, and please subscribe to our channel for more empowering and dramatic daily content.